Deep inside America's oldest mountains, a woman is lured from her cabin by the voice of her dead husband echoing through the fog, only to discover the sound twisting from a lifeless animal. Weeks later, a trucker faces a creature on the highway that's almost a deer, but its head turns backward as it sprints beside his truck. A ghost solves her own murder in court. A photographer meets the legendary brown mountain lights, only to find something staring back. And in the caves, hands claw for escape as decades-old curses wake. Tonight you'll hear 7 true stories, each more disturbing than the last, with previews of every horrifying encounter to come. Whatever you do, don't listen alone. These stories might just call your name when the video ends. Story 1. The Mimic in Copper Hollow. Marlene Guthrie saw it before she heard it, the thing that would finally convince her she was not alone out there in Copper Hollow. It was just after 3 in the morning, the hour where even the crickets give up and the world feels like it's holding its breath. Her kitchen light was off, the only glow coming from the orange tip of her cigarette and the weak porch bulb bleeding through the thin curtains. When a shape moved at the edge of the tree line, habit made her step closer to the window. She thought it was a deer at first, then it looked up at her. Its neck bent too slowly, like someone remembering which muscles to use. Its jaw sagged open, hanging crooked on one side. And from that ruined mouth came her dead husband Earl's voice, clear as if he were standing right in front of her, saying, "Marlene, honey, open the door." Her heart didn't just pound, it stopped, then lurched in her chest so hard she had to grab the counter to stay upright. Earl's voice sounded exactly the same as it had the morning he died in the logging accident. Softly teasing, like he expected her to laugh and tell him to quit fooling around. The deer's eyes were wrong, clouded like milky glass, no light catching them at all. But the sound pouring out of it was pure Earl, right down to the tired rasp he'd picked up from a lifetime of cigarettes. She knew she should run, call someone, do anything except stand there, but for a moment her brain just stalled. It was impossible. It was Earl. It was a deer. All of that crashed into each other in her mind until she realized she was staring back into that thing's dead eyes and listening to her husband beg her to come outside. To understand why she didn't immediately pass out or call the sheriff, you have to rewind 3 nights. The first time she heard Earl in Copper Hollow, there was no deer, no open rib cage, no nightmare at the edge of the yard. There was only the sound of boots on her front porch and a tune she knew like her own name. That night had been bitter cold, the kind that makes the boards of the old rental groan and pop like they're complaining. Marlene had moved into the little house 6 months earlier, after the insurance check finally cleared and she'd sold the place she and Earl had shared for 22 years. Folks in town said Copper Hollow was quiet, cheap, good for healing. What they didn't mention was how dark it got once the sun dropped behind the ridge. No streetlights, no neighbors in sight, just the black shape of the mountains pressing in and the woods wrapping around the property like they were reclaiming it inch by inch. Marlene had fallen asleep in the recliner with the TV on low, some crime show murmuring about evidence and motives. Around midnight, the power flickered and went off, plunging the room into thick darkness. She woke to silence so heavy it felt like sound had been sucked out of the house. She checked. The time on her phone, 12:07 a.m., sighed and decided to ride it out. She was just leaning back again when she heard the first sound. One slow, deliberate step on the front porch. The old boards creaked the way they always had under Earl's weight when he'd come home late from the night shift. Her stomach dropped. For a second, every reasonable part of her brain sat down and shut up. She knew that step. She knew that exact rhythm. Another step. Another long creak. The sound moved from in front of the door to just beside the window. Then softly a man started humming. It was "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," the same hymn Earl used to hum absent-mindedly while fixing the truck or shelling beans on the porch. They'd played it at his funeral because she'd said it was his song. Now in the pitch-black living room of a house he'd never even seen, Marlene listened to that gentle tune creep along the outside wall. The hairs on her arms rose up like they were trying to leave her body. Her fingers tightened around the armrests until they hurt. She stood up slowly, joints cracking, and padded across the cold floor toward the door. No light leaked around its edges. The humming stopped. Whoever or whatever was out there had paused inches from where her hand hovered above the deadbolt. "Marlene?" The voice came through the wood, muffled but shockingly clear. It was not just similar. It was Earl, from the lazy slide of her name into 2 syllables to the gravelly warmth at the end. "You in there?" For a heartbeat, she forgot the grave. She forgot the coffin and the dirt and the pastor's words. Her throat closed. Tears stung behind her eyes. "Earl?" came out of her like a reflex, a sound she didn't mean to make. Silence. Then the faint scratch of fingertips on the door, like someone tracing the panels. "Open up, honey. It's cold out here." That was the moment sense rushed back in. The image of Earl's casket being lowered into frozen ground hit her hard enough that she staggered back a step. "You're not funny," she whispered, more to herself than to the door. Her skin crawled. The part of her that still woke up reaching for him ached so bad she wanted to throw the door wide and fall into his arms. The rest of her wanted to bolt every lock and hide. She didn't open it. She backed away, one slow step at a time, until she reached the hallway. The voice on the porch didn't repeat itself. The humming didn't return. After a long minute, she heard retreating footsteps. 1, 2, 3. Then nothing but the distant groan of the wind through the trees. In the morning, the power came back with a pop, the TV restarting mid-commercial. Marlene half convinced herself she'd dreamed the whole thing. But when she opened the door to get the paper, she saw fresh boot prints dark in the frost, leading up to her porch and back down again. Big, rounded impressions. The same size as Earl's old work boots. For the rest of that day, she told herself there was an explanation. The meter reader. Some drunk from down the road. A stupid prank. She tried every rational story on for size, and none of them quite fit, but she clung to them anyway because the alternative meant something impossible had happened again in her life. And once was more than enough. The second night ripped even that flimsy comfort away. She'd borrowed an old cassette recorder from the church thrift room years back and never returned it. That night, as the sun bled out behind the mountain and the woods turned into a single black wall outside her windows, she dug it out of a kitchen drawer. She sat it on the table by the door, fresh batteries in, tape ready. "If there's something to hear," she muttered, "I'm gonna have proof." She went to bed early, fully dressed, the shotgun lying on the quilt beside her like an extra spine. Every creak of the house made her flinch. At 2:57 a.m., the recorder on the kitchen table clicked softly as if nudged. Marlene's eyes snapped open. She hadn't heard anything yet, but her body had. It knew the pattern now. Exactly at 3:12 a.m., the front window rattled. It was a light testing rattle, not the full-body slam of wind or a branch. Then came it again. Tap, 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 like knuckles on glass. She moved down the hall with the shotgun in both hands, heart punching against her ribs. The house was cold, colder than it should have been with the heat set to 68. Her breath feathered white in the air. The temperature dropped with each step she took toward the front room, thick and wrong, like she was walking into a freezer that had not been opened in a long time. "Marlene." The word floated through the window before she even reached it, close, too close, like the speaker's lips were brushing the glass. It wasn't a shout. It was a conversational murmur, the way Earl used to speak when he'd come up behind her at the sink. I know you can hear me." She stopped at the edge of the curtains, fingers shaking on the gun's stock. She did not look out. Every instinct screamed that if she looked, she'd see something she couldn't ever unsee. "You're dead," she whispered. Saying it out loud here in the dark made her sound cruel to her own ears. The voice didn't argue. It laughed softly, a warm, familiar chuckle. Then said her private nickname, the one Earl had only used when they were alone. A silly little name he'd made up for her in their first year of marriage, something so dumb she had never told a soul, and would have died of embarrassment if anyone else had known. No one else did know. Every hair on her body rose. The part of her that still ached for him shattered. Tears spilled over hot on her freezing cheeks. "How?" she started, then swallowed. "Open the door," the voice said again, a hint of impatience creeping in. "You're making me feel like a stranger." She did not open it, that night either. Instead, she backed away and fumbled for the recorder, smacking the red button with a trembling thumb. The tape whirred to life, tiny reels spinning as she whispered questions into the dark. "If you're Earl, you tell me something only we would know." The voice obliged. It reminded her of the exact phrase she'd whispered into his ear as he lay in the hospital bed, half lit by monitors and fluorescent buzz. It mentioned the dent in the back of the bedroom dresser from the time they'd bumped it laughing too hard. It said how much cash was hidden under the third floorboard from the wall in the front room. Something even she had half forgotten. Each answer was right. Perfectly, horribly right. The longer she talked, the colder the room became. Her voice shook more with each question until finally she snapped, "If you're really my husband, you'd tell me what happened the day you died." Silence. Then for the first time, the voice faltered. When it came again, the rhythm was slightly off. Not wrong exactly, just delayed, like someone repeating a sentence they'd heard a second ago. "Tree came down faster than it should have," it said low. "Didn't have time to jump clear." Which was true, but not how Earl would have said it. He would have cursed, made a joke, turned horror into a punchline because that was how he handled fear. This voice sounded like it was reciting a fact, not a memory. Before she could press, the temperature snapped back to normal. The sense of presence outside vanished, leaving her swaying on her feet as if someone had been holding onto the corners of the room and just let go. In the pale morning light, she poured coffee with hands that wouldn't quite steady. The cassette sat on the table where she'd left it. She hit rewind, then play, expecting to hear Earl's voice and her own questions. All that came out was white noise, thick, crackling static like someone crumpling paper right against her ear. At one point, she thought she heard something under it, a tone almost like a laugh. But when she turned up the volume, it was gone. That day, she went out to look for footprints again. There were plenty, her own, the distinct double line of deer tracks, raccoon hands near the trash cans. But no boots, no marks by the window where someone would have had to stand to speak that close to the glass. On the third night, Copper Hollow felt like it was watching her. Clouds ate the stars. Fog crawled up from the low places in the holler and wrapped itself around the house, muffling every sound. Even the usual snapping of branches and distant owl calls seemed to stop. Marlene called her neighbor Doug before 9 and made casual conversation much longer than necessary just to hear another human voice. She did not mention Earl. When she hung up, the house felt even emptier. She slept in spurts, jerking awake at every imagined noise. At some point, exhaustion finally dragged her under. When she opened her eyes, the red numbers of the clock read 3:09 a.m. Something was already whispering her name from the back door. It was softer this time, more coaxing than demanding. Marlene, drawn out like a song. She could picture him in her mind as clearly as if she had just seen him, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, that crooked grin on his face. The memory hurt so much she pressed her knuckles against her teeth to keep from sobbing. The recorder was already in her hand before she realized she'd grabbed it. She hit record on instinct. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the hallway boards as she moved toward the kitchen. The air smelled wrong, not just cold but faintly metallic, like old blood and wet iron. "Where are you?" she whispered. "I'm right here, honey." The answer came from just outside the back door now, a shift from the front that set off alarm bells in the animal part of her brain. Predators circle. Predators test openings. "You're so close. Just a little more." She stopped 3 feet from the door. The humming started again, but it was out of order this time. Fragments of the hymn jumbled, notes in the wrong places, as if whoever was doing it knew the tune but not the timing. "Sing the rest," she said, surprising herself. The humming cut off. What followed sounded less like a song and more like someone replaying a melody they had only heard once. Notes too long, others too short. The words came after, but they tangled on the wrong syllables. "What a friend we have in Jesus." It was close enough to make her skin crawl, far enough off to make her stomach twist. "Earl never got the words wrong," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "You always sang it right." Saying "you" by accident made her clamp her jaw shut. For a moment her tongue felt too large in her mouth, like she'd bitten down on something that wasn't food. What happened next changed everything, she would think later, replaying this moment in her mind, because this was when she made the worst decision of her life. The voice grew quiet, almost hoarse, and said, "If you don't come now, you won't hear me again. I can't stay long. It's hard." There was a strain in it that sounded real, that sounded like pain. "Please, Marlene, just open the door. I just want to see you once more." Grief is its own kind of haunting. It makes you do things that don't make sense to anyone who hasn't carried the same weight. Marlene's fingers, vibrating like they belonged to someone else, slid the deadbolt back. The click sounded thunderous in the still house. The voice on the other side went silent, as if leaning in to listen. She opened the door. Fog rolled in low across the porch boards, thick as smoke. The weak bulb overhead flickered, then steadied, painting everything in a sickly yellow. The yard beyond was a wall of gray, the tree line just a suggestion of darker shapes. No one stood on the steps, no one waited at the bottom. For a heartbeat, she thought maybe the whole thing had been in her head. A 3-night breakdown of a lonely widow in a too-quiet holler. Then Earl's voice floated from the edge of the yard, right where the grass melted into underbrush. "Over here, honey. Just a little ways. I can't come closer." She stepped out onto the porch. The boards were icy under her feet, damp with condensation. The air pressed against her skin, heavy and clammy. "Why?" she called, squinting into the fog. The answer came back in a tone that was meant to sound teasing and fell just short. "You know how it is. You gotta come to me this time." Every instinct screamed at her to shut the door and call someone, anyone. But that ache inside her, the one that still reached for the empty half of the bed every morning, won out. She told herself she'd go just to prove it wasn't real, to come back and say out loud, "There's nothing there," and finally sleep. She took one step down, then another. The fog swirled around her ankles like something alive. The voice stayed just ahead, never raising itself, never sounding far, no matter how much distance she felt under her feet. As she crossed the yard, the familiar sounds of night did not return. No owls, no insects, not even the distant rush of the creek she could usually hear at the bottom of the hollow. Only her breathing and that voice, answering every question she threw at it with perfect recall of shared moments, private jokes, things long buried. "Remember the time the truck broke down on Route 9 in the snow?" she asked, more to test it than out of nostalgia. "Yeah, it said easily. You were mad as hell, and then we just stayed in the cab and watched the storm till the wrecker came. You fell asleep on my shoulder. That had happened. Every detail right. Remember what you said to me the night we signed the papers on the house? She tried again, pushing for something deeper. You said, if this place falls down around our ears, I'll still be happy as long as you're in it. The voice replied, nailing the sentence she had never repeated to anyone else. And I said, well, let's hope the roof holds a few more years, 'cause I ain't much for carpentry. She laughed, a cracked, terrified little sound. The fog swallowed it. When she reached the first line of trees, time seemed to stutter. The world narrowed to the beam of her weak flashlight and the space just around her body. The ground grew uneven, roots and rocks snagging at her toes. Branches arched overhead, the leaves above her head a faint suggestion in the murk. Come on, the voice breathed, now from somewhere just ahead and low to the ground. Almost there. That was when she noticed the smell. It had been faint in the yard, more a suggestion than anything else. Here, under the trees, it hit her full force. The dense, sour reek of rot, not the distant carry of something dead in the distance. This was close, thick enough she could almost taste it on the back of her tongue. Her stomach rolled. Her body wanted to turn around, but her feet kept moving, as if the sound ahead had attached invisible strings to her ankles. She stepped over a fallen log, the bark cold and slick under her palm. Her flashlight stuttered, flickered, then flared back up. In that momentary darkness, she heard something wet shift ahead like meat being dragged across leaves. Earl? Her voice cracked. Right here, it said. The beam of the flashlight cut through the fog and landed on a pale shape on the ground about 10 feet ahead. For a second, her mind tried to make it into a rock or a patch of fungus. Then the shape resolved into the curled form of a deer lying on its side. Its belly was split wide open. Ribs jutted up like pale fingers gleaming slick with black, half-dried blood. The internal organs had slumped out onto the ground in a glistening heap, steaming faintly in the frigid air. Flies should have been buzzing around it, but there were none. No sound at all except for her own ragged breathing. The deer's head lifted. It should not have been able to. The throat was a torn, dark mess. Still, the head rose with slow, jerking movements, like a marionette being guided by clumsy hands. Its jaws sagged open, pulling at torn flesh. And from that gaping, ruined mouth, Earl's voice flowed with perfect clarity. There you are, it said brightly, as if she'd just walked into their old living room. I knew you'd come, honey. Marlene's entire body tried to recoil at once. Her knees went weak. The flashlight wobbled, the beam cutting crazed arcs across the carcass. The torn skin, the glistening ropes of intestine, the clouded milk-white eyes staring past her. The voice coming out of that mess didn't match the scene in front of her. Her brain couldn't find a way to fit the two together, so for a long, frozen second, she simply stood there, mind blank, mouth open. Come closer, it urged gently. The deer's head bobbed with the words. The lower jaw stretched farther than it should have been able to, skin splitting at the corners with soft, tacky sounds. You don't look so good, sweetheart. Let me see you. Her throat worked. No, she whispered. It came out so faint she barely heard it herself. The deer's head tilted, an almost human gesture that made bile burn in the back of her throat. Under the familiar warmth of Earl's tone, something else slipped through now. A thin, high thread like a second reedy voice trying to sync up with the first and failing. Don't you miss me? It asked. The words were right, but the timing lagged, as if the mouth was playing catch-up to a recording. In that stuttering gap, she heard it. The real source of the sound was not the torn throat in front of her. It was behind, it not far, just out of sight, hidden by the bulk of the carcass. As soon as the thought formed, little details she'd been too shocked to process before slammed into place. The way the deer's neck didn't quite line up with its spine. The faint, dark shape she could now just make out crouched behind its ribcage. Two glints at about the height of a man's eyes, not catching the flashlight's beam but reflecting something deeper. The fact that every time the voice spoke, there was a half-second where the chest cavity seemed to tremble, not from breath but from something using it like a crude speaker. Her feet finally listened to her screaming instincts. She stumbled back one step, then another, shoes slipping in the damp leaves. A low sound rose from behind the deer, halfway between a hiss and a laugh. The familiar tone cracked like thin ice. "Where you goin', Marlene?" it asked, voice stretching, wrong syllables emphasized. "You came all this way. We ain't done talkin'." The thing behind the carcass shifted. She didn't wait to see more. She turned and ran. Branches whipped at her face, clawed at her arms, slapped her cheeks hard enough to make her eyes water. The flashlight beam jerked wildly, catching glimpses of bark, roots, fog, then sky. Behind her, something moved through the underbrush with a speed that didn't sound like running so much as unfolding, covering distance in long, unnatural strides. The voice followed her, dropping all pretense now, cycling through pitches like it was trying on every throat it had ever heard. One moment Earl, the next a child, then a wet, gargling shriek that made her ears ring. "Marlene," it called high and low at once, "don't you want to see me?" The last word elongated, breaking into a sound that wasn't any language she knew, full of clicks and guttural pops that made her stomach lurch. Her bare feet hit the yard's edge so abruptly she nearly fell. The sudden sight of her house, squat, ugly, painfully normal, was such a violent contrast that for a heartbeat she thought she'd imagined the woods, the deer, all of it. Then she glanced back. The tree line had gone perfectly still. Nothing moved between the trunks. No eyes glowed, no shape loomed, just darkness. But the sense of being watched was so strong she could feel it pressing against her skin like a hand. She bolted up the steps, slammed the back door, and shoved the kitchen table against it with a strength she didn't know she still had. Every lock clicked into place. She stood there, shoulders heaving, listening. Silence. Then directly at her ear, inches away on the other side of the door just above the handle. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." It was Earl again, perfect, tired, almost amused. The cold around the doorframe seeped into her bones. For a second, she thought she felt fingers drag slowly along the wood, tracing patterns. She didn't respond. She couldn't. If she opened her mouth, she knew something else might come out. After a long, stretched-out moment, the presence retreated. No footsteps, no sound. Just the slow easing of pressure in the air, like someone lifting their weight off the house. When it finally felt like she could move without something snapping, she backed away from the door, still facing it, until her calves hit the couch and she collapsed. Dawn came gray and sickly. She didn't remember closing her eyes, but at some point sheer exhaustion had thrown a blanket over her mind. When she woke up, the table was still braced against the back door. The shotgun lay on the floor beside her, half loaded. By 9, she'd packed 2 suitcases and 3 boxes. She called Doug and told him in a voice that barely shook that she was done with Copper Hollow. "Place is too big for me," she said. "I'm gonna go stay with my sister a while." She didn't mention the nights, the deer, the voice. She didn't say that she wasn't just leaving the house. She was fleeing whatever shared that hollow with her. Within a week, she was gone. The little rental sat quiet under the pines again, windows blank, porch empty. The woods creeping 1 inch closer with every season. 2 months later, Doug was on his own porch at the edge of Copper Hollow, hanging shirts on a line in the faint light of an early winter evening. The mountains were already swallowing the sun, turning the sky the bruised purple that meant night would fall fast. His breath puffed white in the cold air. From the far side of his property, the woods stood thick and black as they always did. He had just bent to pick up another clothespin when someone called his name from the tree line. "Doug? You out here?" He froze, the pin snapping in his fingers. The voice was female, weary but cheerful, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. "It's me, Marlene. Can you come help me move this dresser? I got most of my things in, but this one's too heavy." A little laugh followed, the exact nervous chuckle he remembered from a half-dozen small-talk conversations over the fence back when she'd first moved in. He straightened slowly, eyes locked on the shadowed gap between two oaks at the edge of the yard. The fog had started to rise again from the low places, sliding between the trunks like white fingers. He could not see anyone standing there, but her voice floated out again, gentle and impatient. "Come on now. I'm losing the light. You know how dark it gets out here." Doug wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly aware of how alone he was. The road into town wound 5 miles of switchbacks. No other houses sat within shouting distance. The smart thing to do, he knew, was to go back into his own house, shut the door, and call her. Check just to be sure that she wasn't back in Copper Hollow after all. His phone was inside. Her voice came again, a shade closer. "Doug? You hear me?" Later, when he tried to describe the feeling, the only words he could find were these. It sounded exactly like her, down to the way she rolled her R's and clipped off the ends of her sentences. But under it there was a thin echo, delayed by a fraction of a second. Like someone else, deeper in the trees, was practicing the same words at the same time, learning a new shape for its mouth. He took one step toward the house, then another. His heart beat so hard he thought it might show through his shirt. At his back, from the tree line, Marlene's voice called one last time, bright and hopeful and wrong, all at once. "Don't be rude now, neighbor. I came back just to see you." He did not turn around. And as he reached his door with shaking hands, Doug understood something Marlene had learned too late. In Copper Hollow, if something you love calls your name from the dark, you never, ever answer. Story 2. The Greenbrier Witness. By the time the jury filed back into the Greenbrier County courtroom, every seat on the wooden benches was taken, and people were standing shoulder to shoulder against the walls, craning their necks for a glimpse of the man on trial for killing his wife. The air was hot and stale, crowded with sweat, perfume, and the faint, sour smell of fear. Outside, the Appalachian winter had rolled in hard, but in here the stove crackled and the room seemed to pulse around one point. A thin, gray-haired woman sitting rigidly in the first row, hands clenched around a worn black Bible. When the foreman rose and announced the verdict, guilty of murder in the 1st degree. All eyes flicked from the defendant to that woman, Mary Jane Heaster, because everyone in Greenbrier knew this wasn't just any trial. This was the trial where the dead had taken the stand. The judge's gavel struck wood, the murmur swelled, and for one dizzy second Mary thought she heard her daughter Zona's voice again, layered over the noise, whispering, "I told you they'd believe us, Mama." Her fingers tightened so hard on the Bible that the leather dug into her skin, and she remembered the first night her daughter had walked back into that little farmhouse, weeks after they buried her. Before Zona became the Greenbrier ghost in courthouse whispers and newspaper headlines, she had just been Mary's only living child. A stubborn, bright-eyed girl who'd made the mistake of falling in love with the wrong man. His name was Erasmus Shue, Edward to some, Trout to others. A blacksmith with a quick smile, strong hands, and a past he never quite described the same way twice. He'd followed work into the West Virginia hills and within weeks followed Zona home from the general store. Folks in town said it was too fast. They met in the autumn of 1896 and married before the winter winds came down off the mountains. Mary hadn't liked Erasmus on sight. There was something about the way he watched her daughter, too possessive, too hungry, as if Zona were a thing he'd bought rather than a wife he'd won. She'd argued, pleaded, tried to forbid the match, but Zona was 23 and love makes people deaf. In the end, Mary stood in the little church on the valley road and watched her daughter say, "I do," while Erasmus squeezed her hand a shade too hard. Snow dusted the peaks that day. By January, Zona would be in the ground. The day Zona died, the mountains wore a hard, bright sky, the kind that made the cold sharper. Mary had woken before dawn to the usual rhythms, wind grumbling around the eaves, the stove ticking low, the creak of timbers. She spent the morning with a knot in her chest she couldn't explain, a sense of wrongness that had her burning biscuits and snapping at the neighbor's boy. Around noon, that same boy, Anderson, the one Erasmus sometimes paid to do errands, came running up the path to her house, face white under the freckles, scarf hanging loose. He tripped over his own boots in his haste to get to her door and blurted, "Miss Heaster, ma'am, Mr. Shue sent me. He says Miss Zona's poorly. She ain't answerin'." The way he said "ain't answerin" made the floor tilt for a second under Mary's feet. She grabbed her shawl and followed the boy down the frozen road, each breath a ghost in front of her, the mountains looming like dark, wordless witnesses. The shoe house sat low in the hollow, smoke trickling from its chimney. The door stood ajar, crooked on its hinges. Inside, the first thing she saw was her daughter lying at the foot of the narrow staircase, face turned up to the ceiling, one arm stretched above her head at an odd angle. Someone, Erasmus, she'd learned, had already moved the body onto a fainting couch and dressed her in a high-necked burgundy dress, stiff with ribbons and lace, the kind she had always hated wearing in life. A veil was pulled up under her chin and fastened so tightly with a scarf that the skin bulged around it. Her hair was arranged neatly over the pillow as if this were a staged photograph and not the way they'd found her. "She took sick," Erasmus said, appearing from the doorway with wild eyes, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hands trembling just enough to show. "I came back from the smithy and found her like this. Doctor says it was her heart. You know she was weak in the heart, Mary." Except she wasn't, and they both knew it. Dr. Knapp did come, eventually bouncing along the rutted road with his bag and his breath puffing in front of him. By the time he arrived, Erasmus had been alone with the body for nearly an hour. When the doctor tried to examine Zona, her husband hovered so close it was almost comical, cradling her head to his chest, insisting on adjusting the scarf around her neck every few seconds, saying she was too cold if anyone lifted so much as a lock of hair. The doctor, flustered and put off by the display of overpowering grief, barely touched her. He listened to Erasmus's account, how she'd been not herself the last few weeks, weak, kinda out of sorts, and declared the cause of death, everlasting faint. Later, under pressure, he would change it to childbirth, even though no neighbor had seen a pregnancy and no signs of it were visible. But in that cramped room, with the widower practically snarling at anyone who came too near, Knapp closed his bag, patted Mary on the arm, and told her sometimes the Lord just called the young ones home early. Mary looked down at her daughter's face, pale even under the rouge someone had smeared on her cheeks, at the strange angle of her jaw beneath the scarf, and felt the knot in her chest harden into something cold and sharp. Something was wrong with Zona's neck. And whatever had happened in this house, the man moaning theatrically beside her knew more than he was saying. They buried Zona quickly, as was the way in winter. The ground was hard, the air smelled of iron and wood smoke, and her coffin went into the frozen soil under a sky the color of dirty cotton. People cried, clucked tongues, patted Mary's shoulders. Erasmus made a show of near collapse, leaning so heavily on one of his friends that at one point Mary feared he would slide into the grave after the coffin. When it was over, she went home alone to the small house that now held more silence than anything else. In the days that followed, sorrow settled over the valley like fog, but under Mary's grief ran a thin, singing wire of anger. Each time she pictured her daughter lying at the base of those stairs, she saw the bruised-looking flesh above the scarf, the way Erasmus had snapped at the doctor for trying to touch her neck. She found herself talking aloud sometimes as she sat in her rocker by the stove. "If he did this to you," she said into the flickering light, "you tell me. I'll listen. I'll believe you. I swear to God, Zona, I'll get you justice if it's the last thing I do." It was the kind of promise a mother makes into the empty air, never expecting an answer. The answer came on the 11th night. Mary had not been sleeping well since the funeral. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her daughter in the burgundy dress, mouth slack, scarf digging into her throat. On that particular night, the wind had stopped, and the usual groans of the old house had gone still. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the moonlight painting pale rectangles on the floor. Sometime after midnight, the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that her breath plumed white in front of her. The hairs on her arms lifted as if a storm were about to break overhead. Then, without the creak of a door or the sound of a step, someone sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under a familiar weight. A faint sweet smell rose into the air, the lavender and starch of the dress she had helped Zona wash for Sundays, mixed with the warm, human scent of her child's hair. Mary froze, fingers clenching around the blanket. Her first instinct was to close her eyes and pray. Her second was to fling them open and not miss a second of whatever was happening. The second instinct won. She turned her head slowly, as if moving too fast might scatter the vision like smoke. Zona sat on the bed in the same dress they had buried her in, every pleat and ribbon perfect, as if she had just come from church instead of the grave. Her skin glowed with a pale inner light, her hair loose around her shoulders the way she'd worn it as a girl. For a heart-stopping moment she looked alive, just tired, just sad, just older somehow. Then Mary's gaze dropped to her neck. The scarf was gone. In its place was a ring of dark, mottled bruises, deep as if fingers had sunk into the flesh and squeezed until something broke. When Zona tilted her head, the neck bent too, far in one direction with a grinding motion that made Mary's own spine twinge in sympathy. "Don't be afraid, Mama," Zona said. Her voice was the same as it had been in life, low, with a hint of laughter under it even when she wasn't smiling. But now it carried something else too, a fragile echo that seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, like the house itself was repeating every word a half-second behind her. "I couldn't rest, not till you knew." Mary's fear folded in on itself, crushed under a wave of rage and love. She sat up, tears already on her face. "He did it, didn't he?" she asked. The question had lived behind every other thought she'd had since the funeral. "That man you married, he hurt you." Zona's eyes turned darker, pupils widening as if the memory passing through her was a shadow. "He broke my neck," she said simply. "He didn't mean to, not at first. He was just mad. But then he liked how it felt." The ghost lifted a hand to her throat, fingers sinking in enough to show the bone beneath shifting obscenely, and for a heartbeat the room filled with the brittle sound of cartilage snapping. Mary's stomach turned. She forced herself not to look away. Her daughter told the rest of it in a voice that never rose, never trembled, as if she were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. She said she'd made dinner late that day and Erasmus had come home spoiling for a fight, accusing her of not cooking what he wanted, of not minding him when he'd told her to do this or that. The argument escalated, as they always did with him, but instead of stomping out or throwing a cup, this time he grabbed her by the neck with both hands, shook her so hard her teeth rattled, then swung her like a rag doll. "He meant to scare me," she said, eyes fixed somewhere over Mary's shoulder. But his thumbs were under my jaw, and when he jerked me back, there was this sound, like a green stick breaking, and then I couldn't feel my legs. Her voice never wavered, but her head lolled to one side at an angle no living body could maintain. I saw the ceiling, then the stairs, then nothing. When I woke up, I was on the floor at the bottom of them, and he was talking to himself, practicing what he was going to tell the neighbors. According to Zona's account, he'd propped her up, dressed her, tied the scarf around her damaged neck so tight it hid the worst of the angle. He'd begged the doctor to call it a fainting spell, anything but what it was. And all the while she'd been there, just out of reach, screaming into a world that suddenly had no ears for her. "I tried to pull your sleeve when you came in," she said, eyes finally meeting Mary's. "But you walked right through my hand." The first night, the vision faded after that, dissolving into the cold air like a breath. Mary was left alone on the bed, sobbing into her hands, the imprint of her daughter's weight still pressed into the mattress. If it had ended there, she might have convinced herself it was grief, a nightmare brought on by too many days of crying and not enough food. But Zona came back the next night, and the next, and the next. Each visit brought more details. She showed Mary with horrifying clarity how her head could now spin all the way around, turning slowly, vertebrae grinding, until her face looked back over one shoulder at an angle that made Mary's vision swim. "See," the ghost would say, her voice flat. "This is how I was lying when they found me." She described the exact cupboard where Erasmus had hidden a certain piece of clothing he didn't want anyone to see, one he'd stained that day. She named the dates and towns where his first two wives had died under suspicious circumstances, one from a fall, one from mysterious illness, and the way he'd walked away from both clean as a Sunday plate. "I ain't the first, Mama," she said on the third night, eyes burning with a light that had nothing to do with the cold glow of her form. "But I'll be the last if you listen." By the fourth night, Mary wasn't just grieving. She was taking notes. She sat up in bed with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper, writing down the names of the places, the phrases he'd used, every unnatural detail of Zona's appearance. When the ghost showed her the angle her neck could bend, she forced herself to sketch it, hands shaking. The final visit ended with Zona standing in the doorway, half in this world, half in the next, her form already thinning at the edges. "They won't take my word," she said quietly, "but they might take yours. Make them open me up, Mama. Make them look at my neck. When they see what he did, you tell them I told you." Then softer, the way she used to say it when she was late coming home as a teenager and knew she was in trouble. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you." For the first and only time, her voice cracked. Then she was gone. In the bright cruelty of daytime, Mary would sit at her kitchen table and wonder if she'd lost her mind. The world outside went on. Wagons creaked along the road, children shouted, the church bell tolled the hour. But inside, the house felt full of another timeline overlaid on this one, a set of bloody footprints only she could see. She didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe that her dead daughter had come home to give a deposition? It was only when the weight of the promise she'd made to Zona, the oath whispered into the stove's glow weeks earlier, threatened to crack her ribs, that she went to the county prosecutor. John Preston was a practical man, used to sorting land disputes and drunken brawls, not spectral testimonies. When Mary sat down opposite him in his office, shawl pulled tight, eyes ringed with sleepless purple, he braced himself for rambling hysteria. Instead, she spoke calmly, every detail sharp, every date precise. She did not flinch when she said, My daughter told me she was murdered. She told me how. She told me where the bones in her neck are broken. You dig her up and you'll see." The prosecutor shifted in his chair, papers whispering under his fingers. Greenbrier was not a place where you ignored a respectable widow's certainty, especially when it lined up with the quiet misgivings the doctor had already confessed to him about that hurried exam. Between Dr. Knapp's unease and Mary's relentless, clear-eyed insistence, the scales tipped. They exhumed Zona's body on a gray day that made the world look like it had been drained of color. A small crowd watched from the edges of the cemetery, pretending not to stare. Mary was not allowed near the autopsy, performed in the one-room schoolhouse they'd hastily converted for the purpose, but she stood outside in the biting wind and listened. For hours, the low murmur of male voices rose and fell. At one point, a sharper exclamation cut through, followed by a strange, heavy silence. When the doctor finally came out, his face was pale, his hands shaking just enough to be noticeable. He confirmed quietly what Zona had told her mother in the dark. The neck was broken in multiple places. The windpipe had been crushed. Finger marks were visible in the bruising that had gone all the way down to the bone. No fainting spell, no childbirth. This was strangulation, deliberate and violent, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. Erasmus Shue was arrested not long after. In the weeks that followed, Greenbrier buzzed like a disturbed hive. Stories ran ahead of the truth. Some said the body had sat up on the table and pointed at her husband, others that the doctor had seen the ghost himself. The reality, when stripped of gossip, was already unbelievable enough. A man with 2 dead wives behind him now stood accused of killing a third, and the push that reopened the case had come from a grieving mother who claimed to have been visited by her dead child. Whether the prosecutor believed in ghosts or not, he believed in evidence. The autopsy had given him that. The trial, however, would give the town something else, a story they would still be telling a century later. In court, Erasmus tried to wear the same mask of shattered grief he'd used at the funeral, but cracks showed. Witnesses spoke of his temper, his possessiveness, the way he'd spoken about his wives as burdens rather than partners. Dr. Knapp described his initial discomfort at the scene of the death, hemmed in by a husband who wouldn't let him examine the body properly. But it was Mary's testimony everyone had come to hear. When she took the stand, the room fell into a hush so thick it seemed to muffle even the winter wind outside. Under oath, she told the jury about the nights after the funeral. She told them about the dip in the mattress, the scent of lavender on the air, the bruises that showed on her daughter's neck in the soft lamplight. She described with a steady voice how Zona had explained the exact way her neck had been broken, how he'd snapped it between the first and second vertebrae, using words Mary herself would never have known without being told. When the defense attorney tried to paint her as a superstitious mountain woman prone to visions and religious hysteria, she did not waver. "I am as sure of what I saw as I am that I'm standing here speaking to you now," she said. "And what I saw and what the good doctor found are the same. My daughter told me the truth. You can bury a body, gentlemen, but not a lie." The jurors shifted, some uncomfortable, some fascinated. The judge later instructed them to disregard the ghost aspect of her story and focus on the physical facts. But the seed had been planted. The things Zona had said from beyond the grave matched, point for point, what the autopsy had revealed. The timing of her appearances lined up with Mary's visible exhaustion in those days. The accused man's past bristled with enough death to make any coincidence look sinister. In the small, enclosed world of that mountain county where faith and fear often intertwined, it was enough. When the guilty verdict was read, Erasmus's face finally cracked all the way open. For a heartbeat, the mask dropped, and Mary saw the man she had always suspected was underneath. Eyes flat, jaw tight, a flicker of pure black hate aimed not at the court, not at the prosecutor, but at her. Then the deputies closed in, the shackles clinked, and he was led away to serve a life sentence that would be cut short when other prisoners decided they didn't care for wife killers. The newspapers in the cities called it the Greenbrier Ghost Case, printing articles that snickered at mountain superstitions even as they marveled that a judge had allowed Mary's testimony at all. Out in the holler, the story traveled by word of mouth, shaping itself to each teller's needs. Some said the ghost had appeared in the courtroom itself. Others swore the jury had seen handprints on Erasmus's shoulder as if someone unseen were holding him down. As for Mary, she never once backed away from her account. Until the end of her life, if asked, she would say the same thing. That her daughter came back, that she told her exactly what had been done to her, and that every broken bone the doctors found proved it. On certain cold nights, walking past the cemetery where Zona lay, folks whispered they sometimes saw a slim young woman in old-fashioned clothes standing by a particular stone, her head held at a slightly odd angle, as if the muscles there had never quite relaxed. They said she looked peaceful in her own way. Justice, after all, had been served. Not by the law alone, but by a mother who'd listened when the mountains let the dead speak, and by a daughter who refused to stay quiet just because the earth had closed over her. Story 3. Not deer on Route 23. By the time the thing turned its head all the way around and looked at him through the driver's side window, Vincent Reese was already doing 60 down a 2-lane stretch of Route 23, the kind of Appalachian highway that clung to the side of the mountain like an afterthought. Outside, there was nothing but black trees and the thin ribbon of asphalt. Inside, the cab of his 18-wheeler was a vibrating box of engine noise and flickering dashboard lights. The creature should have been in his rearview mirror, lost in the dark a mile back, but it wasn't. It was pacing the truck on the shoulder, hooves hitting gravel in a rhythm that did not match the speedometer, long legs folding and unfolding with an insect's precision. For several frozen seconds, Vincent watched the impossible through a smear of bug guts and road salt, his hands locked on the wheel. It had the body of a deer, mostly, lean, long-legged. Tawny hide stretched tight over bone, but its joints bent in the wrong directions, hocks flexing forward like elbows, knees twisting too far to one side whenever it pushed off the ground. Its neck was too long, arching up from the shoulders in a smooth, unnatural curve. As he stared, the head rotated, vertebrae clicking like someone running fingers along a row of bottle caps, until its face was pressed almost flat to the glass, eyes level with his. That was when the world shrank to a tunnel. The yellow smear of lane lines, the white glow of his headlights, and 2 bottomless black eyes reflecting nothing at all. An hour earlier, the night had been nothing more than another long haul through familiar hills. Vincent had been running loads through eastern Kentucky and southwest Virginia for almost 15 years. He knew where the road narrowed, where state troopers liked to sit with their lights off, where the asphalt buckled in winter. He knew every local warning, too. Don't stop on certain pull-offs, don't pick up hitchhikers after midnight. Don't whistle back if the woods whistled first. The locals at the diner told stories about not deer, things out there that looked almost right until you stared too long, but he'd chalked that up to mountain folklore, the kind born of boredom and too much beer. That night he'd left the depot in Pikeville just after 9. Trailer empty, planning to make it across the state line before calling it. The radio crackled low with classic rock. The dashboard glowed a tired green, and the only company he had were the vague shapes of distant houses on far-off hills, their porch lights glowing like grounded stars. By 11, the sky had clouded over, erasing the moon. The road climbed and twisted, cutting between walls of rock and stands of bare trees that crowded close enough to brush the side mirrors. Vincent rolled his window down a crack to let out the stale cab air and drew in a lungful of sharp, cold mountain wind. It tasted like dry leaves and coal dust. His eyes were starting to burn from the monotony of headlights on asphalt when something darted into the edge of his high beams. Too fast, too low. Instinct jerked his foot off the accelerator. The shape vanished before he could process it. Probably a fox, he told himself, or one of those half-starved stray dogs that roamed the pull-offs looking for handouts. He eased back to speed, fingers flexing on the wheel. The second time he saw movement, it wasn't a dart but a glide. Far ahead, where his headlights couldn't quite reach, something crossed the road with the slow, deliberate grace of a deer that does not know what a truck is. He clicked his high beams and the world ahead of him snapped into sharper relief. Gray guardrail, wet blacktop, a thin veil of mist beginning to rise from the ditches. The shape was gone. He scanned for the twin pinpricks of eyeshine that usually gave deer away, but the night returned nothing. "Pay attention, man," he muttered to himself, rubbing his face with one hand. "You're seeing shadows." He passed a rusted green sign for a town whose name was more bullet holes than letters. Another 10 miles of curves unspooled under his tires. The truck's engine settled into a low, steady growl. He'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined the movement when something stepped out of the trees onto the shoulder, close enough this time that he could see the outline clearly. Deer. His brain slotted it into that word automatically. 4 legs, slender body, narrow head. It stood just beyond the white line, facing away from the road, ears perked toward the forest. Vincent's foot moved to the brake without conscious thought. Slamming into a deer at highway speeds could kill a man as easily as any head-on collision. He downshifted, eased off the gas, and laid his palm against the horn in one long, blaring note. The animal did not flinch. He was 50 yards out when its head lifted. Slowly, too slowly. Vertebra by vertebra, the neck uncoiled, rising higher than it should have until the snout was almost level with the top of his hood. Still, the creature did not run. It turned its head slightly, just enough that he caught the edge of one eye. There was no reflection, no startled white glare, just a flat, matte darkness like a hole punched through reality. Vincent's hands went slick on the wheel. Everything in him screamed at him to stop, to reverse, to do anything except close the distance, but the empty weight of the trailer shoved him forward. Inertia carrying him toward the thing whether he liked it or not. At 20 yards, the creature moved, not away from the truck, but toward the road, stepping over the white line with a peculiar, delicate precision. Its front leg bent at an angle his mind rejected, joint folding forward like a person's elbow. The hind leg followed with a twist that made his stomach clench. It didn't trot or leap. It articulated. Like a man climbing down from a high shelf in slow motion, lowering himself into the lane, one careful limb at a time. "Nope," Vincent said aloud, voice too loud in the cab. His skin prickled, a flush draining from his face and pooling somewhere cold in his gut. Something was wrong with what he was seeing, wrong at a level deeper than words. He swerved, not much, enough to give whatever this was some room, but the road was narrow and the guardrail pressed hard against the drop on the other side. The truck's tires shuddered against the rumble strip. He yanked it back, fighting the wheel. The high beams washed over the animal full on, bleaching it in white light. It froze, caught. For a heartbeat, it looked like any other deer, if thin and ragged. Then its entire back rippled, skin crawling like something underneath was adjusting itself. The head snapped toward him with a speed that didn't match its earlier movements. The neck bent, not turning in a smooth arc, but jerking in segments, like a puppet's head being spun on a dowel. The muzzle kept going, chin tucking toward the chest, then further, further, until the top of the skull faced the road and the eyes were upside down, staring at him over the bridge of its own nose. In that impossible posture, the mouth opened. Vincent did not hear a sound, but every part of him recoiled as if he had. The truck roared past, the thing sliding out of the cone of his headlights and into darkness. He stamped on the accelerator without thinking, the trailer whining as it strained to keep up. His heart battered his ribs, his breath came in short, shallow pulls. "You didn't see that," he told himself, the words tumbling over each other. "You didn't see anything." After a shuddering minute, the rational part of his brain offered an explanation. Bad angle, a trick of perspective, maybe a wounded animal whose neck had been broken by an earlier car. Roadkill that hadn't fallen down yet. He clung to that thought like a lifeline. Then something slapped the side of the trailer. It was a sharp, hollow thud, the sound of weight hitting metal. The cab shivered. Vincent's eyes flew to the right mirror. For half a second, he saw nothing but the smear of his own headlights bouncing off the guardrail. Then the mirror angle caught the shoulder, and he saw it. The knot deer was running alongside the truck, not behind, not falling back, keeping pace. Its legs moved in a blur now, too many joints bending in too many directions, each stride stretching the body longer, thinner, like meat pulled on a hook. It should not have been possible for any living thing to move that fast on four legs in loose gravel without stumbling. But it did. Hooves, or what looked like hooves, barely touching the ground. He was doing 40, then 45, then 50. The speedometer climbed, and for a blessed moment the creature dropped out of the mirror's range, eaten by darkness. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The breath turned into a choked noise when the passenger side window went dim, like someone had stepped between him and his own headlights from outside. It was there, pressed so close to the glass that every detail stood out. The peppering of ticks in short, dirty fur, the crusted edges of old scars splitting the hide, the faint, sour smell of wet animal that somehow leaked through the vents. One long foreleg was hooked over the running board, joint twisted in a way no deer's could twist, giving it the leverage to haul its front half up to peer in. Its chest convulsed with each impact of the back legs on the gravel, but its face stayed eerily level with his, as steady as if it were looking in from a parked stance. Up close, the differences were impossible to ignore. The muzzle was too narrow, teeth too numerous, tiny yellowed points lining gums where there should have been a simple row of chewing surfaces. The nostrils flared not in time with any visible breath. And the eyes. Those were the worst. No shine, no whites, just glossy pits that seemed to swallow the light instead of reflect it. When his gaze locked with those, a static buzz started at the base of his skull and crawled down his spine. He jerked the wheel and the truck drifted toward the center line. Tires screamed. Somewhere a horn blared back at him. A car in the oncoming lane swerving as his trailer dragged over the double yellow for a terrifying second. He wrestled the wheel, brought the rig back into place. The other vehicle's red taillights dwindled in the mirror, then vanished around a bend. When he looked back to the passenger window, the knot deer's head was gone. He didn't realize he was crying until something warm hit the back of his hand. He swiped at his face with his sleeve, pulling air into his lungs in ragged gulps. "Keep it together," he rasped. The CB sat silent. His phone, plugged into the console, displayed no service in tiny, indifferent letters. The road signs had grown less frequent in the last 15 miles. He tried to remember the last exit, the last indication that anyone else used this stretch of road regularly. It seemed like the mountains had closed in behind him, swallowing the world he knew and leaving only the truck, the strip of asphalt, and the black. The quiet lasted just long enough for his shoulders to start unclenching. Then something tapped on the driver's side window. Tap, tap, tap. It was a polite sound, gentle, as if someone wanted to ask for directions. Vincent's entire body went rigid, he knew. Down to his bones, down to that animal part of the brain that had watched predators from the safety of cave mouths, that he should not look. That looking was an invitation. an acknowledgement, a kind of opening. He stared straight ahead, knuckles white on the wheel, pulse in his throat. Tap, tap. Don't, he whispered to himself. His eyes burned from not blinking. The road blurred, the yellow lines swam. The tapping came again, slightly harder this time, accompanied by the faint scrape of something sharp dragging across the glass. The sound did not match the movement of the truck. It was as if the source of the noise floated alongside him, anchored to the cab rather than the road. His gaze slid sideways, almost against his will. The creature's head was level with the glass, but its body was not visible. It was as though the neck rose straight up from the bottom of the window, longer than any deer's ought to be. A pale, sinewy column that disappeared into shadow below the frame. Its mouth was closed now. The eyes were inches from his face, separated only by the thin barrier of glass and the faint reflection of his own terrified expression superimposed over them. The pupil, or what should have been pupil, expanded, swallowing the rest of the eye in a slow, dilating pulse. As he watched, the skin around the sockets seemed to ripple. The creature tilted its head, studying him like a specimen. Then its mouth opened again. This time there was sound. It did not come through his ears so much as through his teeth, vibrating his fillings, humming in his skull. It sounded like a tape being played backward. Guttural consonants sliding into wet vowels, frozen breath scraping over something too large for a throat. Snatches of almost words flickered around the edges of it, fragments that made his brain flinch. His name, maybe. The names of roads he'd driven 1,000 times, bits of radio jingles mashed together into nonsense. It was like the thing had swallowed every sound it had ever heard near this highway, and was spitting them back out in one long, garbled strand. Vincent screamed. He didn't remember deciding to. The sound tore itself out of him, raw and high. His hand shot out toward the window controls, slapping at the switch as if he could somehow roll the glass up through the intruder's face. The button clicked uselessly. It was already closed. The noise outside cut off mid-syllable. For a second, the only sound in the world was his own ragged breathing and the truck's protesting engine. Then something hit the side mirror. The driver's mirror snapped forward, metal screeching against metal as it folded like a broken arm. The sudden loss of that slice of vision threw his sense of balance off. The truck drifted. He hauled it back into line, eyes wide, scanning the remaining mirror, the windshield, every place the thing could appear next. Nothing. Empty road, endless trees, the white ghost of his own face in the glass. He drove like that for miles, or what felt like miles, time having become a warped, stretchy thing. The numbness that followed the spike of terror made everything feel distant, like he was watching himself from outside his own body. Eventually, a familiar glow appeared ahead, the washed-out fluorescent smear of a truck stop. The yellowed sign emerged from the dark, gas, food, parking, like a miracle. Relief hit him so hard it was almost painful. Civilization, people, lights, noise, things with names and rules. He pulled off the highway so fast the trailer wobbled. The access road crunched under the tires, gravel popping. The lot was nearly empty at that hour, just 2 other rigs sleeping nose to tail and an old sedan with one headlight burned out. He parked under the brightest light he could find, engine idling, and sat there for a long minute, hands locked on the wheel, waiting for his heart to remember how to beat like a normal organ instead of a trapped animal. When he finally shut the truck down, the sudden silence rushed in, roaring in his ears. Inside the truck stop, the world was small and safe and ugly. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A TV bolted in one corner played a late-night infomercial no one watched. The smell of burnt coffee and fryer oil wrapped around him like a greasy blanket. A woman in a faded polo shirt glanced up from behind the counter, gave him a nod and went back to her magazine. The ordinariness of it all made him feel like he'd imagined the entire drive, like he'd stepped through a curtain from a nightmare into a convenience store. He went straight to the restroom, gripping the sink when he saw himself in the mirror. His face was gray under the fluorescent wash, eyes bloodshot, a smear of something dark, grease or dirt, along his jaw. He leaned closer. For a second in the glass, the reflection behind his shoulder seemed wrong. The angle of the stall door, the shadow in the corner, something too tall standing where no one should be. He spun around. The restroom was empty. The shadows were just shadows. When he turned back, his reflection was normal again, aside from the tremor in his hands. Coffee helped. So did the low murmur of two other drivers at a corner table trading complaints about dispatch and weather. Their voices were solid, grounding. Vincent sat at the counter, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug, and listened without really hearing until one of them said, "You see any deer out there tonight? They were thick as thieves up near Jenkins last week. Damn near took my bumper off." Before he could talk himself out of it, Vincent said, "Saw one." His voice sounded rough, like he'd been screaming. "Sort of." The nearest driver, a heavy-set man in a ball cap that had seen better decades, turned on his stool to look at him. "Sort of?" he repeated, an eyebrow lifting. Vincent wasn't a man given to telling stories. He'd always prided himself on being grounded, practical, the kind who checked his tires twice and his paperwork 3 times. Now, words spilled out of him in a low rush. The shape on the shoulder, the way the legs bent, the eyes, the head pressed to his window while the body ran in a different rhythm below. He left out the part where he'd heard his own name in the static of its voice. That detail felt too private, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. When he finished, the diner noise seemed to dim around them. The man in the ball cap didn't laugh. He didn't say, "You were tired," or "You sure it wasn't just a busted-up buck?" He glanced at the woman behind the counter, then back at Vincent, his expression gone careful. "You were coming up from Pikeville way?" he asked. "Yeah," Vincent said slowly. "Route 23. The man nodded once, like that was the answer he'd expected. "You hit that stretch between the old mine and the state line?" "Think so. Used to be a herd cross there regular," the man said. "'Fore they put the new development in anyway. Lot of 'em got taken out by trucks. Deer don't understand blind corners and schedules." He took a sip of his coffee, eyes fixed on some point over Vincent's shoulder. Course, that was before the first guy put a rig clean through the guardrail trying to avoid something he swore wasn't quite a deer. They pulled him out of the cab 200 feet down the ravine, swearing up and down the thing was waiting for him at the bottom. Folks said he was just in shock. Folks say a lot of things. The second driver, who'd been quietly stirring sugar into his coffee, spoke up for the first time. "My cousin works wrecker on that stretch," he said. "He says if you're gonna hit 'em, you hit 'em. Deer, bear, whatever. The ones who try to be careful, the ones who try to save the critter, they're the ones he pulls out with their necks broke." He looked at Vincent, eyes flat. "But if you see one that looks at you like it knows you, you don't hit the brakes. You don't look it in the eye. You don't even admit you saw it. You just keep driving and you don't stop till you're where there's lights." The woman behind the counter made a face. "Y'all are gonna scare him off his route," she said, but there was no real heat in it. Her gaze flicked to the dark windows where the parking lot light made a yellow halo against a whole lot of nothing. "They got a name for 'em, you know. Not deer. 'Cause they look like what they ain't." Vincent should have felt better knowing he wasn't the only one. Instead, a deeper dread settled in his chest. If others had seen it, if it had a name, that meant it wasn't just a trick of his eyes. It was a pattern, a presence woven into this road like a flaw in the asphalt. Somewhere out there, between the mine and the state line, Something that wore a deer's shape like a costume was still running in the dark, waiting for headlights. He finished his coffee with hands that shook only a little. The drivers went back to their talk. The TV droned on about miracle knives that could cut through pennies. The world stubbornly kept turning. Eventually, he walked back out to his truck, boots crunching on the gravel. Under the lot lights, the rig looked battered but ordinary. Dirty white trailer, scuffed cab, one mirror twisted in. He ran his fingers over the metal where the unseen weight had struck it. There were no marks, no dents, no blood. Inside, the cab smelled faintly of cheap air freshener and old fast food wrappers. He shut the door, locked it, and sat there in the dark for a long moment before turning the key. The dashboard sprang to life. The headlights carved twin tunnels into the night beyond the truck stop. For a second, he thought he saw at the edge of that light a shape standing just beyond the circle of safety, tall and thin and listening. He blinked, and it was gone. He took a different route on the way back the next night. It meant an extra 40 minutes and more tolls, winding along a lower road that hugged the river instead of climbing the mountain. Dispatch grumbled about the deviation, but he didn't offer an explanation. He just said there'd been wildlife issues up on 23 and let them interpret it how they wanted. In the weeks that followed, he heard other drivers at other counters mention strange things on that stretch. Accidents with no clear cause, animals frozen in the beams like they'd been waiting on purpose, shapes in the woods that didn't disappear when you honked. He never went back to that route after dark. On the rare occasions daylight found him near that mile marker, he forced himself to look at the shoulder. There was nothing there. Just dirt, scrub, trash thrown from windows, bottles, wrappers, a shredded tire. The trees beyond were ordinary, leafless in winter, green in summer, birds flickering between the branches. If he rolled the window down, the air smelled of exhaust and pine. No rot, no static in his skull. Still, some nights when he was parked in a rest area miles away, engine off, cab rocking gently under the weight of passing trucks, he woke up convinced someone was tapping on his window. 3 soft knocks. A pause, 2 more. In those moments, heart hammering in the dark, he stayed very still, staring at the thin line where curtain met glass, telling himself over and over that sound was just cooling metal, nothing more. He never checked. He never looked. Because Vincent Reese had learned something about the mountains that winter. On certain roads, there are things that want to be seen by you, specifically you. And once they know your face, once they've watched you behind the wheel and pressed their eyes to the glass to study how your fear works, they don't forget. Story 4. The Salt Lick Burial Ground. They didn't find the bones the first time the earth tried to give them back. That morning in late October of 1963, the only thing on 12-year-old Caleb McKendry's mind was getting the mule team down to Old Man Sutter's Salt Lick before the storm rolled in over Stone Mountain. The sky had that mean, greenish tint it got before a cold front slapped down off the ridge, and his father's last words before sending him out the door were, "Move your tail, boy, I want them animals watered 'fore the bottom falls out." The Salt Lick sat at the far edge of their land, down past the sagging fence line and through a stand of maple older than the county itself. It had been there as long as anyone remembered, a gray-white patch of exposed earth where deer and cattle had scraped away the soil over generations to get to the mineral seep beneath. The McKendrys ran their stock there every fall. It was the kind of place that felt permanent, like the mountain itself. But that morning, when Caleb led the mules through the thinning grass, he saw at once that something had changed. The ground around the lick had sunk in a rough oval, maybe 4 feet long, the earth caving as if something had shifted far below. In the middle of that sagging patch, the night's rain had washed away the topsoil and left something pale and smooth sticking up through the mud. For a second, he thought it was a rock. Then the shape resolved into a curve, a hollow, a row of nubs that looked too much like teeth. He stopped so abruptly the lead mule snorted and almost plowed into his back. The chill that shot through him had nothing to do with the wind. Kneeling in the wet dirt, he reached out with one shaking hand and brushed away the clinging soil. A jawbone stared back at him, one end shattered, the other still holding 4 brown, worn-down teeth. Above it, the outline of a skull pushed against the earth, the suggestion of eye sockets and cheekbones just beneath a thin skin of mud. For a heartbeat, Caleb thought. Animal. Deer, maybe. Pig. Something left here years before. Then he saw the fill of those sockets, the angle of the cheek, the shape that was wrong for any beast he knew and exactly right for something else. His breath hitched. Every story his granddad had ever told him about this land and the war and the men who went missing on it came roaring back like a flood. They'd grown up on those stories. The old folks in the Stone Mountain Valley treated the Civil War like it had happened last winter instead of 100 years ago. Around coal stoves and front porches, they talked about bushwhackers slipping through the laurel thickets, about Union patrols that never came back from certain gaps, about neighbors who stepped out after dark and vanished between one heartbeat and the next. One name came up more than most. Henry Sutter. He'd been 20 when the war came to the holler, tall and reckless and loud about the fact that he wasn't about to fight for rich men on either side. Folks called him that Sutter boy in the same tone they used for a lightning strike. Then one October day in 1863, he'd walked down the old wagon road toward the Salt Lick with a shovel on his shoulder and hadn't come home. Some said the Union boys had grabbed him for a guide. Some swore the local pro-Confederate raiders had dragged him up into the woods and taught him what happens to fence-sitters. His mother insisted to her dying breath that he'd been taken, not killed, and that the mountain was holding him somewhere. His father, Old Man Sutter of Caleb's time, would just spit and say, "Stone Mountain don't give back what it wants." Now, 100 years later, Caleb knelt on Sutter land, or what used to be Sutter land before the McKendries bought it for cheap, and stared at a human skull pushing its way toward the light, exactly where the stories said Henry had last been seen. The wind picked up, carrying the sour tang of wet leaves and something else, something older and coppery. The mules shifted, ears flicking, whites of their eyes showing. One stamped and tossed its head, tugging at the rope. Caleb swallowed hard, every instinct in him screaming to run, to get back to the warm kitchen and his mother's voice and pretend he'd never seen this. But another part, the same stubborn streak that had him sneaking out to listen to his granddad's grown-up war stories, kept him there. The idea that this might be Henry Sutter himself, this set of bones finally rising after a century in the dark, dug into him like a hook. He backed away slow, then turned and ran, leaving the mules crowding nervously at the fence. His boots slapped through mud and dead leaves, heart hammering in his throat. By the time he burst through the back door of the farmhouse, he was muddy to the knees, breathless and pale enough that his mother dropped the biscuit pan. "What in God's name?" she started, then saw his face and grabbed him by the shoulders. "Caleb Aaron, you been shot?" He shook his head, words tumbling over each other as he tried to explain. Skull, Salt Lick, teeth. His father's expression went from irritation to a wary stillness that told Caleb he believed him even before he said, "Show me." They took shovels and a lantern, though it was still broad day outside, and trudged back to the lick with the kind of heavy, resigned air men wear on the way to a hard job. His father said nothing, but Caleb saw the way his jaw worked, the way his eyes kept flicking to the tree line as if expecting something to step out. The ground looked worse the second time, softer, pocked with Caleb's footprints and the mule's sharp hooves. The bone sat where he'd left it, a pale crescent in the mud. His father knelt beside it, fingers brushing away soil with the same gentleness he'd use on a newborn calf. when more of the skull emerged. Sockets, brow ridge, the jagged break at the back, he swore under his breath. "This here's a somebody," he said quietly. "Not too deep neither. They should have called the sheriff. They both knew it. But in that valley, people didn't invite law unless they had to. The mountain had its own ways of handling things, and there was the matter of who this might be. Henry Sutter's family had once owned everything from the creek to the ridge, including the exact patch of ground Caleb and his father were now standing on. Owning a man's land and then digging up his kin on it had a certain sour taste to it, even if the deed said the McKendries were in the clear. So instead they fetched Granddad. The old man took one look at the exposed skull and closed his eyes. The lines in his weathered face deepened, as if the sight had added another 10 years to him all at once. "I told your daddy not to graze this low," he muttered. "Told him this place ain't right." He squatted down with a slow grunt, fingers brushing the dirt with surprising delicacy. "You see this?" he said, tapping a spot near the base of the skull where the bone had a punched-in look, a small crater edged with hairline cracks. "That ain't from no fall. That's from a rifle butt or rock, hit from behind." "Henry?" Caleb whispered, hardly daring to say the name. Granddad didn't look at him. His gaze was far away, back in a year none of them had seen. "He come down here that last day with his shovel," he said. "Said he'd heard there was old salt pits under the lick. Wanted to see if he could open up a new seam. Your great-granddaddy told him not to fool with it. Mountain holds what it holds," he said. But Henry laughed. He didn't believe the land could mind. The old man's fingers tightened on the shovel handle until his knuckles went white. Then he was gone, and the lick got real quiet for a long while after. They dug, careful and slow, widening the hole until the full skeleton emerged in the late afternoon light. It lay face down, arms pinned awkwardly under the body, legs twisted as if they'd been kicked out of place when the earth settled. The skull had that crater near the back. The right hand was missing 3 fingers. The remnants of cloth clung to the ribs and hips in rotted scraps, just enough to show that it had once been a shirt and trousers, not an animal hide. When they turned the body as gently as they could, dust puffed from the bones like the last breath of a long-dead man. In the chest cavity, something small and dark rattled, a rusted button maybe, or the last piece of a belt buckle. Caleb's mother refused to come near. She stood at the edge of the field, apron twisting in her fists, eyes hard and bright. "You put him back when you're done lookin'," she'd said when they first left the house. "And you say a prayer, or 3. And you don't bring whatever's attached to him into my kitchen." She'd grown up in the same stories as Granddad, but where he met them head-on, she preferred a healthy distance. By the time the sun dipped low and the cold bit through their jackets, the 3 of them had done what they could. They wrapped the bones as gently as they could manage in an old quilt, said a clumsy, heartfelt prayer, and reburied them a little higher on the hill under a lone oak, where spring flowers always seemed to come early. Granddad carved a simple cross into the tree's bark with his pocket knife. They didn't put up a stone. Saying out loud whose bones those were without proof felt like inviting something. Still, in their heads, they all called that spot Henry's Rest. That should have been the end of it. A boy finds old bones, a family does right by the dead, and the mountain goes back to sleep. For a while, it seemed like that's what happened. The livestock moved past the new grave without balking. The salt lick hardened again over winter, tracks of deer and elk crisscrossing it as they always had. Caleb tried not to think about the feel of bone under his fingers, the way the empty sockets had seemed to look up at him from the dirt. He was mostly successful, until the whispers started in the McKendry house. They began small, a soft murmur at the edge of hearing as he drifted off to sleep. like someone standing just outside his bedroom window talking through the wall. At first he thought it was his parents or the radio left on in the front room. But when he crept down the hall, the house lay still and dark. His mother snoring softly, his father's arm flung over his eyes. The whispering stopped when he left his room, resumed when he lay back down. It was never loud enough to make out words, just a low, insistent sound like breath and syllables trying to form themselves. Then came the footsteps. Not heavy boots or the clomp of hooves across the yard. These were soft, dragging steps like someone walking barefoot and half asleep down the hallway. Caleb woke one night to the sound of a board creaking outside his door, one specific board that always complained under weight. The hair on his arms rose. He lay very still, eyes wide open in the dark, listening as the slow steps passed his room and moved toward his parents' door. They stopped there. A long pause, then faint as a sigh. 3 knocks, not on wood, on something hollow. Caleb heard his father stir, mutter, "What?" to his mother, who grumbled and rolled over. Neither of them got up. The knocks came again, this time with a little more urgency, and then the sound faded, as if whoever was doing the knocking had sunk into the floor. The next morning at breakfast, his father complained his dreams had been bad. "Dreamed somebody was pounding on my chest trying to wake me up," he said around a forkful of eggs. "Felt it right here." He rubbed at his sternum, brows drawn. "Woke up out of breath." Caleb dropped his toast. Butter spattered his plate. He did not mention the footsteps. The more they tried to pretend nothing had changed, the more the house insisted it had. Tools went missing and turned up in odd places. His father's favorite hammer found half buried at the edge of the salt lick, handle sticking out of the earth like a marker. The kitchen chairs were pulled a few inches away from the table some mornings, as if someone had sat down in the night and then scraped back their seat without making a sound. Once Caleb found the back door standing open just a crack, winter air knifing in. Snow had blown onto the mat, but there were no footprints, as if the cold itself had walked in. It was Granddad who finally said what they were all thinking. "He ain't settled," the old man muttered one evening, staring into the fire. The family sat close together in the front room, the wind whining around the corners of the house. "You moved his bones, but you didn't move what happened to him." "What's that supposed to mean?" Caleb's father snapped more harshly than he intended. Fear had made him sharp. "We did right by him. We put him up on the hill proper. You said so." "I said you buried him," Granddad replied. His eyes, cloudy with cataracts, still had a hard, clear center. "I didn't say the place you put him wanted him. Salt Lick held him a long time. Place remembers. And the way a man dies, that soaks in too." He tapped his temple. "You brought all that inside when you brought him up here. Sometimes it takes time to bleed out." That winter was the coldest anyone could remember in the valley. The creek froze over in thick slabs. Pipes burst. Livestock miscarried. Folks whispered that Stone Mountain was in one of its moods again, the kind that took and didn't give back for a while. The McKendries did what they always did, worked, mended, waited for spring. But in their house, the waiting had a different quality now. Every groan of the timbers sounded like a voice trying to push through. Every gust of wind down the chimney carried for an instant the faintest echo of words. It was Caleb who saw him first. On a night when the fire burned low and his parents had gone to bed early, leaving him alone with a book and the ticking of the old clock, the house felt as if it were holding its breath. The usual background noises, the crackling of settling heat, the scuttle of mice in the walls, had fallen silent. Outside, snow piled against the porch boards. The window near the front door had frosted over from the inside, steam from supper having condensed and frozen on the cold glass. Caleb turned a page, eyes heavy, when the clock struck midnight with a hollow, echoing sound. On the 12th chime, someone walked past the window. It was a man's shape, shadowed and distorted by the frost, but unmistakable. A broad-shouldered figure in an old-fashioned hat, head bent slightly forward like he was watching his feet in the snow. Caleb's heart lurched into his throat. No one should have been out in that weather. No one had land close enough to warrant walking instead of driving, and no truck engine had sounded in the yard. He sat frozen, eyes glued to the milky pane. The figure passed the window, then another, then circled around toward the back of the house. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put. Instead, he found himself on his feet, book forgotten on the floor. He moved to the back door, bare feet flinching at the cold boards. His hand hovered over the knob. Through the thin wood he heard it. Not footsteps, not a hand on the door, but a low, steady murmur like a man talking to himself. The words were indistinct, syllables running together the way they do when someone thinks no one is listening. He caught only snatches. Cold, too long. Left with the salt. Ain't finished. Then clear as a whisper into his ear. You pulled me halfway out, boy. Don't you walk off and leave me. He yanked his hand back like he'd been burned. The voice dropped away at once, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. He backed away from the door and did not sleep until the gray light of dawn seeped into the corners of the room. Spring came eventually, as it always did in the mountains. The snow melted in dirty, receding patches. The creek roared with runoff. Small green things pushed up through last year's leaves, stubborn and soft. The unease in the McKendry house ebbed with the frost. The whispers grew less frequent, the footsteps fainter. They told themselves that whatever they'd stirred up was settling again, sinking back into the land like water into thirsty soil. Then in May of 1964, the Montgomerys bought the old Sutter place. The Sutter farmhouse had stood empty for decades, half rotted into the hill, its windows gaping like hollow eyes. Folks said it was a bad house, and not just because the roof sagged and the chimney leaned. Men heard things when they stayed there fixing fence. Low sobbing from empty rooms, the thump of boots in the attic when no one was up there. But the Montgomerys were from off, a family from downstate with more hope than sense, looking for cheap land and a fresh start. They put money into repairs, hammered and painted all that summer. By fall, yellow light spilled from the windows most nights, and the sound of their youngest, a girl named Liza, laughing as she chased the barn cats across the yard, floated up to the McKendry place on the wind. For a little while, it seemed like the valley might forget about Henry Sutter again. The salt lick settled. The grass grew over the disturbed earth around the oak. Caleb, now 13, busied himself with school, chores, trying not to stare too long at the hill when he was out cutting wood. The strange nights in his house faded into something you could almost believe had been a boy's overactive imagination. The mountain breathed easier. Until one night in late October, almost exactly a year after he first saw that skull at the lick, Liza Montgomery started screaming. Her voice cut through the thin autumn air like a knife. Caleb's father was halfway to bed when it hit, and he and Granddad were out the door before his mother could say a word, boots crunching on the cold ground. Caleb followed on instinct. The three of them ran across the field, the dark bulk of Stone Mountain at their backs, the Suter house, Montgomery house now, looming ahead. The windows glowed an ugly, feverish orange. The front door stood wide open, light spilling onto the porch like blood. Inside, the scene was chaos. Mrs. Montgomery stood in the front room, wild-eyed, hair half pulled from its pins, clutching her youngest boy to her chest. Mr. Montgomery had one arm braced against the wall like he needed it to stay upright. In the middle of the room, Liza crouched on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking so hard her heels thumped against the boards. Her face was gray, eyes huge and unseeing. "He was in my room," she kept saying, voice hoarse. "He was in my room, he was in my room." "What happened?" Caleb's father demanded, the question aimed at no one in particular. Mrs. Montgomery swallowed, throat working. "She woke up screaming," she said. "When we got in there, she was halfway out the window like she'd been pulled. Said somebody was leaning over her bed." Her voice broke. "Said he was missing half his head." Lisa's gaze snapped up at that. For the first time, she seemed to focus on someone. Granddad standing just inside the door, cap in his hands. Her pupil shrank. She pointed one shaking finger at him, then past him to where the dark hallway yawned toward the back of the house. "He was standing right there," she whispered, "dripping on the floor, dirt all in his hair. He asked me whose house this was now. He said he'd been left, said he was stuck halfway between the salt and the stone." She started to laugh then, a high, thin sound that didn't sound like it belonged to a child at all. Her mother slapped a hand over her mouth and pulled her close, murmuring nonsense comforts. Granddad went pale under his sun-browned skin. "You found him," he said to Caleb's father, voice barely more than air. "You brought him up, but we never gave him back to where he belonged. We took him from salt ground to house ground, and now he don't know which one's his." The events of that night bled into the rest of the season. The Montgomerys started hearing things as the days shortened. Thumps in the walls, low voices in corners, a wet dragging sound in the hall at 3 in the morning like someone pulling something heavy from room to room. Once Liza's older brother woke to find dirt scattered on his floor in the shape of boot prints, leading from the window to the bed and back again. On another night, Mrs. Montgomery walked through the kitchen to find every spoon in the drawer laid out in a line pointing toward the back door, their tarnished bowls all facing up as if waiting to catch something. Stories spread as they always did. Kids at school whispered that you could see someone standing in the Sutter house's upstairs window after midnight. Face turned toward the salt lick, head cocked at a strange angle. Old men at the feed store shook their heads and said this was what happened when you stirred up battlefield ground without asking. There were rumors that the Montgomerys called in a preacher from 3 towns over to cleanse the house, that they sprinkled holy water in the corners and hung crosses over every bed. It didn't help. The last time Caleb saw the Montgomerys, it was the spring he turned 15. Their furniture was piled in the back of a borrowed truck. Mrs. Montgomery looked 10 years older than she had when they arrived. Lisa kept her eyes on the ground, one hand wrapped tight in her mother's skirt. When Caleb's mother walked over with a pie and a note with their new address, just in case, Mrs. Montgomery took it with shaking hands and said, "We'd stay if it was just sounds. You can ignore sounds, but when your girl wakes up every night with dirt in her mouth and says a man stood over her asking if this was his bed now, well, a bargain's a bargain. This house ain't ours anymore, and I don't know whose it is, but it's not ours." After they left, the Sutter Montgomery house went still again. Windows broken by kids from town who weren't afraid of old stories. Vines crawled up the porch posts. The roof sagged farther. The oak over Henry's quiet grave on the hill put out new leaves each spring, its carved cross slowly swallowed by healing bark. The salt lick itself grew patchy. The deer stopped coming as often. Cattle balked at the edge of its circle, eyes rolling, refusing to step onto the pale ground no matter how hard they were driven. By the time Caleb was an old man telling his own grandchildren why they didn't let the stock near that low place anymore, the details of that first skull sighting had blurred. The Civil War felt as distant to them as the moon. But certain things stayed sharp in his mind. The feel of the wet earth under his nails, The way the sockets of that skull had seemed to lock onto his, even under a layer of clinging mud. Liza's small voice saying, "He said he was stuck between the salt and the stone." On quiet nights when the wind dropped and the mountain held its breath again, he could still hear, if he let himself, a faint, patient knocking at the edges of his thoughts, like somebody rapping on the beams of an old house from the inside, waiting for someone to answer and tell him, finally, where he was meant to rest. Story 5. The Brown Mountain Watcher. By the time Cassidy Vaughn realized the light wasn't just hanging over Brown Mountain but watching her, she'd already been out there long enough for the November cold to crawl up through her boots and settle in her bones. She'd driven 6 hours from Charleston with a trunk full of camera gear and the kind of stubborn excitement only a true skeptic has when they're certain they're about to debunk something famous. Brown Mountain had been spitting out ghost lights for more than a century. Glowing orbs that floated above the ridges, drifted along tree lines, and then winked out without a sound. People blamed swamp gas, headlights, trains that no longer ran, even reflections from distant towns. Cassidy, who worked part-time for a regional magazine and full-time as the sort of woman who rolled her eyes at paranormal TikToks, was here to get long exposure shots that would, she told her editor, finally show folks they're just atmospheric junk. She hauled her pack up to the overlook, breath puffing white, set up her tripod facing the dark bulk of the mountain, and waited for the show. The overlook was lonelier than she'd expected. In the online photos, it was always crowded. Families in camp chairs, couples sharing blankets, other photographers jostling for a clear shot. Tonight, a Tuesday in the off-season, the parking lot below held only her Subaru and a battered pickup with a local plate. The man leaning against the truck had nodded once when she arrived, then gone back to staring at the horizon with the resigned patience of someone who'd seen this 100 times. "Lights don't come every night," he'd said when she'd asked how often they appeared. "And they don't come for everybody." When she'd laughed and said, "Well, they better show up for me, I've got a deadline," he'd given her a look she couldn't quite read and replied, "Careful what you ask for, ma'am. Some folks get more than they came for." After an hour of nothing but wind and the faint hum of the highway far below, he'd climbed into his truck and left with a wave. Alone now, Cassidy checked her settings again, more to keep her hands moving than because anything needed adjusting. ISO high but not blown out, aperture low, shutter ready to open for 30 seconds at a time. The sky was moonless, a river of stars running from horizon to horizon. Brown Mountain itself lay in front of her like a sleeping animal. Its contours suggested more by the absence of starlight than any visible detail. Locals called the lights searchers, ghost women, Cherokee widows, lost hunters, but to Cassidy they were data waiting to be captured. She took a series of test shots just to get the foreground right, flipping back through them on the camera's tiny screen. Darkness, darkness, darker darkness with a hint of silhouetted trees. Her toes went numb. Her fingers burned, then dulled. Time stretched. It was almost midnight when the first light appeared. She didn't see it with her eyes at first. She saw it on the back of the camera. She'd just finished a 30-second exposure and hit playback, expecting another frame of nothing, when she saw it. A small, perfect orb hovering above the ridgeline, just off-center, bright as a dropped star. It wasn't lens flare, no corresponding street lamp or car headlight, no sharp angles, just a soft, contained glow. Heart-tripping, she lowered the camera and stared at the place it should have been. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, as if responding to the attention, a pinpoint of white pulsed into being over the same patch of mountain, a distant lantern through invisible fog. It grew. Not fast, more like a slow inhalation, from pinprick to marble, from marble to golf ball. Its edges stayed sharp, not bleeding into the darkness around it, a clean, contained sphere that hovered above the tree line as steadily as if hung from a wire. Cassidy's mouth went dry. She'd seen photos, clips, shaky phone videos with zoomed-in pixels, but none of them had prepared her for how wrong the light felt in person. It wasn't the color or the motion. It was the sense of intent, like whatever was making it had a reason beyond simple physics. "Oh," she whispered, not sure who she was talking to. Her fingers fumbled on the remote shutter. The camera clicked, mirror slapping, collecting photons, 30 seconds, 60, 90. The light stayed where it was, steady as if posing. She took shot after shot, glancing between the mountain and the playback. In each frame, it appeared in exactly the same spot, the same size, as if it hadn't moved at all. That wasn't how car headlights behaved. That wasn't how flares drifted. This thing was fixed, like an eye. The thought came uninvited and lodged itself in her mind. It's not over the mountain. It's over me. The overlook jutted out from the road like a small balcony, a concrete lip facing the wilderness. The light's position from her vantage point was directly ahead. But if it was closer, if it was not a mile away over the ridge but 200 yards out past the guardrail, it would look the same. The realization sent goosebumps racing up her arms. To test it, she shifted 3 feet to the left, dragging the tripod with her, muscles stiff from the cold. If the light were distant, it would slide slightly in relation to the mountain, changing its angle to the peaks behind it. It didn't. It remained locked over the same invisible point in space relative to her. A pin stabbed through the fabric of the night, tracking her tiny sideways move. "Okay," she said aloud, voice too loud in the heavy quiet. "That's interesting." She tried to make it sound like curiosity instead of fear. Her breath steamed and vanished. She snapped another shot, then another, each one feeling less like documentation and more like a conversation. She would move. The light would stay. She would point. It would pulse once in reply, the glow brightening for a heartbeat before settling back. Once, in a sudden burst of nerve, she lifted her headlamp and flicked it on, waving it in a slow arc. The orb dimmed, then flared in sync like a call and response. Any explanation that involved distant cars or swamp gas grew thinner by the second. After nearly an hour of this, Cassidy realized something else. The world had gone too quiet. When she'd first arrived, she'd heard night sounds, crickets, the occasional distant owl, the faint rush of water far below. Now there was nothing but the whisper of wind and the occasional tick of her cooling engine in the lot behind her. The silence pressed in around her, making the sound of the camera shutter seem indecently loud. The light, impossibly, seemed to brighten in that hush, as if drawing power from the absence of other things. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump hard enough to almost knock the tripod over. She fumbled it out with stiff fingers. A text from her editor blinked on the screen. "Anything yet?" followed by 3 question marks. Cassidy turned, angling her body toward the parking lot so the screen's glow wouldn't blow out her night vision. She typed back, "Got something. Actually pretty weird. Will explain." Before she could hit send, the phone screen flickered. The signal bars in the corner, which had shown 1 or 2 weak lines all night, dropped to 0. The message failed. A small red exclamation point appeared beside it like a warning. When she turned back toward the mountain, the light was gone. Her heart sank in a rush of irrational loss. From something to nothing in the span of a breath. The spot where it had hovered was now just darkness, a blank patch of sky. The disappointment hit her almost like grief. "Come on," she muttered, irrationally offended. "You can't just bail like that." She knew how petulant it sounded, talking to an unexplained atmospheric phenomenon. But the feeling that something had been in conversation with her and then hung up mid-sentence gnawed at her. She squinted, scanning for any trace of lingering glow. That was when she realized the overlook was no longer being lit from the front. The faint illumination she'd unconsciously been relying on, the way the concrete under her boots had been just barely lighter than the drop beyond, hadn't been from the distant orb at all. It had been from something much closer. Now, as she stood in the dark, she became aware of a soft white radiance on the ground around her feet, wrong for starlight, wrong for her headlamp, which was currently switched off and heavy on her forehead. It was diffuse, but directional, casting a shadow of her body that stretched toward the guardrail. Slowly, heart thudding, she turned around. The light hung 10 feet above the overlook between her and the parking lot, no more than 30 yards away. Up close, it wasn't a neat sphere. It was layered. Concentric shells of faintly different brightness, like a lantern wrapped in thin, uneven cloth. The center pulsed, a heartbeat tempo, swelling and dimming in a rhythm that made something in her chest try to sync up with it. It didn't make a sound, but her ears rang as if she stood under a high-voltage line. The air around it seemed thicker, too, as though she'd stepped into the heavy, charged atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Cassidy's knees went weak. For a wild second, she thought she might be sick. The urge to run slammed into her, almost as strong as the raw, compulsive need to step closer and see what exactly was inside that light. "Nope," she whispered instead, backing up until her calves bumped the cold concrete lip of the overlook. The drop beyond was a black nothing. The only solid things in the world were the guardrail at her back and the light in front of her. She realized, somewhere under the wash of adrenaline, that if she panicked and bolted now, she could easily go the wrong direction and pitch herself into the ravine. That thought anchored her like a nail. "Okay," she said again, more to herself than to the thing. Her breath came in ragged puffs. "Okay, you're close. That's new." She reached for the camera without taking her eyes off the light. Her fingers brushed cold metal, found the shutter button, pressed. The familiar click was almost reassuring. She took another shot, then another, hands shaking so badly she half expected the images to be a blur of motion. The light responded. As the third shutter snapped, it elongated, stretching from a sphere into a taller, oblong shape. The lower edge drifted down until it hovered maybe 6 feet off the ground. Within it, details emerged, not physical objects so much as impressions. Movement, the sense of depth where there should have been only glow. Cassidy squinted, eyes watering. For a moment she thought she saw a silhouette inside the radiance, a narrower shape at the top, broader below, like a person in a long dress holding something out in front of them. The bright center flickered, then steadied. The hair on the back of her neck prickled so hard it hurt. Then from the center of that impossible lantern a voice spoke. "Have you seen my children?" It was a woman's voice, low and hoarse, with an old, dry grief, words shaped by an accent older than the asphalt under Cassidy's boots. It did not so much cut through the air as appear inside her head, bypassing her ears entirely. She flinched back anyway, shoulders slamming into the metal rail, a burst of rusty pain under her shoulder blades. Her first irrational thought was that someone had crept up on her from the parking lot. But when she tore her gaze away from the light for a split second and glanced past it, the lot was empty. No cars, no people. Just the pale cone of its glow on cracked pavement. The voice came again, a little nearer, as if the speaker had stepped forward inside the light. "Please." They were here. They were just here. The edges of the glow trembled, the inner pulse quickening, an agitation that felt too human for whatever this was. Images flickered through Cassidy's mind that were not her own. Torches bobbing through black woods, smoke stinging tear-reddened eyes, bodies on a hillside under a sky gone red with fire. She saw women, many of them trudging up a slope, calling names into the smoke until their voices broke. lanterns swinging in hands raw from digging. For a second, she stood in 2 times at once, her boots on concrete and layered underneath, bare feet on dirt churned to mud and blood. Cassidy squeezed her eyes shut. The images vanished, but the dizziness remained. I don't know who you're talking about," she forced out, her own voice small and thin in the charged air. She felt ridiculous answering, but silence felt worse, like ignoring a direct question from someone sitting right in front of her. "I'm just here for the—" She almost said lights, but the word felt wrong in her mouth, like an insult. "For pictures." "Pictures," the voice repeated, flattening the word into something unfamiliar. Inside the light, the outline shifted. The impression of shoulders lifted, as if the figure were straightening. "You look, you take, you leave." There was no accusation in the tone, just a weary statement of fact. Then, sharper, "But you don't look where they are." The temperature plummeted. Her breath went from mist to visible, billowing clouds. Frost crackled under her boots as a thin sheet of ice raced out from under the light, crawling across the concrete in branching veins. The camera strap grew frigid against her neck. Cassidy's teeth began to chatter even as sweat prickled under her jacket. The instinct to bolt surged again, hotter this time, but her legs felt rooted. Where are they?" she asked before she could stop herself. The answer did not come in words. Instead, the light flared, then dove. It did not move like an object falling. It lunged. One moment it hung in front of her, the next it was on her. Through her, filling her vision with white. For a split second, she felt every atom in her body lit from the inside out, as if she'd been converted to electricity. There was no sense of weight, of skin, of separate self, only a roaring brightness and a chorus of other people's voices pouring through her, layered and jagged, too many to make sense of. Mothers calling names, children screaming, men shouting orders in a language she did not know. Underneath it all, a low, steady sobbing, the sound of someone who has been crying for so long they have forgotten how to stop. Then it was over. Cassidy collapsed to her knees, the camera swinging wildly on its strap and banging against the concrete. She retched, dry heaves racking her chest, though there was nothing in her stomach but coffee and a gas station donut. The world snapped back into place in jarring fragments. Stars overhead, the rasp of her own breathing, the bite of cold air on her wet cheeks. Her hands, pressed against the ground, burned as if she'd plunged them into snow. When she forced herself to look up, the light was back where it had been before, suspended above the overlook, but dimmer now, its edges frayed. The voice, when it came again, was a whisper of a whisper. "They don't answer." A pause, heavy as a grave. "They don't come home." Cassidy swallowed against the ragged edge in her throat. "Who?" she rasped, though some part of her already knew. The images it had shoved through her, the battle, the smoke, the women with lanterns. She'd read one of the legends in a tourist pamphlet on the way up, that the brown mountain lights were the spirits of Cherokee women searching for their dead after a massacre, their lanterns ever burning as they combed the ridges for bones that never quite surfaced. It had been a neat, sad story on glossy paper. Now it felt like a knife. The thing inside the light did not say "my sons" or "my husband." It said with an ache so deep it seemed to come from the rock itself, "My people." The glow flickered. They went in. They didn't come out. The mountain took them. There was a kind of bewildered fury in that last word, as if even now, 100 and some years after whatever had happened, the speaker could not quite comprehend the idea of the land turning on its own. You walk on them. You build on them. You forget. Cassidy thought of the new development she'd passed on the way in. Vacation cabins with big glass windows clinging to the slopes like ticks. She thought of the sign at the overlook's edge with its politely worded history. Many theories have been proposed for the brown mountain lights, from ball lightning to distant automobile headlights. The true cause remains unknown. No mention of bones, no mention of women with lamps and torn feet. "I didn't know," she said, and the moment she said it, she realized how small and stupid it sounded. Of course she didn't know. She'd come for content, for a story, for proof that would make her look clever on a page. She'd treated this place like a backdrop, not a wound. The light dimmed further, edges collapsing inward as if drawing itself back together. "You know now," it said. There was no forgiveness in it, but no new malice either. Just tired acknowledgement. Then softer, almost as if to itself. "We look, we call, we don't stop." With that, it began to recede. Not away, not up into the sky, but back, as if someone were winding it along an invisible string into the darkness over the mountain. For a few seconds, Cassidy could see the shape inside it more clearly. A woman's outline in a straight, old-fashioned dress, hair braided down her back, one arm extended as if she were still holding a lantern, by a handle that no longer existed. Her face was a blur of light and shadow, but the hollows where eyes should have been seemed to burn hotter for a heartbeat as they met Cassidy's. Then the layers folded over themselves, the glow shrank to a marble, a pinprick, and finally nothing. Sound rushed back in. Crickets. The distant bark of a dog in some unseen hollow. The faint whoosh of a car on a road far below. The world resumed like someone had unmuted it. Cassidy sat there, dazed, until her legs stopped shaking enough to stand. She climbed stiffly to her feet, fingers numb, and fumbled her gear together with all the clumsiness of someone working in a dream. Her phone came back to life as she walked to the car, signal bars flickering into existence like reluctant fireflies. The unsent text to her editor finally went through. 3 new messages from unknown number flashed across her screen and vanished before she could tap them, as if the device had hiccuped. In the harsh dome light of the Subaru, her reflection in the rearview mirror looked like that of someone who'd been underwater too long. Pale, eyes too wide, lips bloodless. On instinct, she flipped through the shots on her camera. Frame after frame showed her, small and still against the concrete, with a gorgeous, impossible column of light in front of her, detailed enough that she could see the hint of a figure inside, hands outstretched. In some, the orb hung distant over the ridge. In others, it loomed close, casting sharp-edged shadows. Technically, they were perfect, sharp, well-exposed, eerie as hell. The kind of thing that would go viral in an hour. Only one photo looked wrong. In it, the angle had shifted slightly. The camera must have been hanging awkwardly from her neck when it fired. The frame caught her from the side, face in partial profile, eyes squeezed shut in terror. The light was still there in front of her, but the glow on her features didn't match its position. It lit her from behind, outlining her head and shoulders in a halo she could not explain. As if for that one exposure, something had been standing between her and the lens. She sat in the idling car for a long time, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the share button. Her editor would want the shots. The magazine would pay well. People would talk. The brown mountain lights finally caught in high resolution, complete with a ghostly figure, exactly the kind of thing she'd driven out here to get. Outside, beyond the windshield, the mountain loomed, a darker mass against the night. Somewhere up there, maybe right over the overlook she'd just left, other lights drifted through the trees, unseen, relentless, seeking what they'd lost. "You know now," the voice had said. "We don't stop." Cassidy killed the engine. Silence pooled around the car. In the glow from the dashboard, she selected every image from that night and one by one deleted them. The camera's tiny screen asked, "Are you sure?" She clicked yes until there was nothing left but black. In the morning, when her editor called, excited and impatient, she would say that the lights hadn't shown. that sometimes folklore stayed folklore. It would sound like a lie, it would be in a way. But as she pulled onto the dark road and wound her way back down the mountain, she understood something the pamphlets and science articles and skeptic forums hadn't prepared her for. Some hauntings don't want proof. They want witnesses. And once Brown Mountain knows you can hear it, it doesn't need your pictures. It will keep calling your name in the quiet parts of your life, in the space between sleep and waking, in the way your headlights occasionally catch nothing at all and you feel eyes on you anyway. Until the night you find yourself turning off the road unbidden back toward that overlook. Because you remember a voice asking, "Have you seen my children?" And you're no longer sure the answer will always be no. Story 6. Flesh and Bone Harvest. By the time Angela Drummond understood that the people watching her from the tree line weren't feral at all, but organized, patient, and following rules older than the county itself, her state-issued sedan was already sunk axle-deep in the mud of a forgotten holler road. The failing light caught on the dented hood, on the state seal peeling at the edges of her door, and on a ring of pale, stripped-clean bones hung like wind chimes from a low branch above her. They clicked together in the breeze with a sound that was almost like teeth, almost like prayer. Behind them, half hidden between laurel and hemlock, a dozen faces waited, lean, pale, eyes reflecting nothing. For the first time since she'd taken the social worker job for rural outreach in the mid-1970s, Angela realized that the phrase, "folks who live back in there," had never meant what she thought it did. The referral that sent her into the Virginia mountains that October had been routine on paper. Anonymous complaints about wild people stealing livestock, scaring kids, maybe squatting on state land. No names, no addresses, just a cluster of reports from the same two hollers over 6 months, each more frantic than the last. A farmer missing 3 goats in a single night, all taken without a drop of blood left behind. A school bus driver watching a naked, mud-slick figure sprint up a rock face on all fours. A hunter who'd gone too far upslope and come back babbling about houses made of hides and fires you couldn't see from the road. The sheriff's office was tired of wasting fuel on what they called mountain rumors. Angela's supervisor, eager to show the federal grant committee they were proactive about isolated populations, slid the thin file across her desk and said, "Go up, take a look, write it up. Even if they're just vagrants, we can tick the box for attempted contact." The drive had started pretty. Coaltown gave way to red maples and yellow birch flaring under a high blue sky. Houses grew farther apart, porches sagged, mailboxes leaned. Every few miles she'd see someone, an old woman hanging laundry, a knot of kids kicking a flat ball, a man in a John Deere cap tightening straps on a truck bed, and each time she'd get that same look when she asked about strange folks up past the ridge. A tightening around the eyes. A brief glance toward the mountains. A shrug that said, "Don't know, don't want to know." Finally, at a gas station perched where the blacktop narrowed to what barely counted as road, the attendant, a man with nicotine-yellowed fingers and a VFW cap, wiped his hands on a rag and said, "You going up through Lick Run?" When she nodded, trying to sound casual, he just shook his head. "Roads bad, people's worse." Her map, a creased, out-of-date state issue, showed the logging track into Lick Run as a faint gray vein branching off the main road, climbing into the green mass labeled simply National Forest. The first mile wasn't so bad, gravel, washboarded but passable, the sedan rattling but game. Trees closed in, laying shadows across the hood. The radio gave up its last station and sank into static. A mile later, gravel turned to packed dirt, then to something softer, slicker. Angela kept going, knuckles whitening on the wheel, telling herself this was what she'd signed up for. Going where other people wouldn't, where help didn't reach. where kids might be growing up without schools, without doctors, without anyone writing their names on any form. She saw the first sign they weren't alone at a switchback where the road cut tight against the hill. There, nailed into a poplar at shoulder height, was a triangle of bone. Rib, she thought at first, strung with what looked like teeth and little bundles of twigs bound in red thread. Something had charred the edges, darkening them to a greasy black. It turned slowly in the breeze, pointing first up the road, then down, like an indecisive compass. She slowed, staring through the windshield. Some part of her, the part that still went to church on Christmas out of habit, whispered the word curse. The rest, the trained, rational social worker, cataloged it as local superstition. Maybe some kid's idea of a joke. Maybe not. Either way, not her problem. She drove on. The mud found her 2 turns later. What looked like solid earth was, under a false skin of leaves, a long rut full of last night's rain. The front tires slid in with a sickening, sucking sound. She braked too late. The car's nose dipped. The chassis scraped rock. When she tried to reverse, the wheels spun uselessly, spitting brown water. She cursed, short, sharp, vulgar, and killed the engine before she dug herself in any deeper. For a long minute she just sat there, listening to her own breathing and the faint tick of cooling metal, nausea washing through her at the thought of the call she'd have to make to the county garage. Stranded on a mountain road, no radio, no cell service, night coming on. Then the forest reminded her it was there. Somewhere upslope a branch snapped, not the dry, natural crack of dead wood falling, short, deliberate, foot on twig. Another closer. The sound of weight moving through undergrowth, not crashing, not running, but deliberate. Angela's hand went automatically to the pepper spray in her bag. The state training had been clear. Remote work meant risk. She yanked the key from the ignition, stuffed it in her coat pocket, stepped out into the cold air, and tried to sound like she did this sort of thing every day. "Hello," she called, voice bouncing oddly off the trees. "This is Angela Drummond with Social Services. I'm here to check on folks up this way. I'm not law enforcement, I'm just here to talk." Silence. Then faintly, a laugh. It was a child's laugh. High, breathy, quickly smothered the way kids sound when they're not supposed to be overheard. It came from somewhere to her right, where the hill rose steeply, thick with rhododendron. "It's okay," she said, forcing cheeriness she didn't feel. "I'm not here to take anybody away. I just want to make sure everybody's got what they need." She thought of all the pamphlets in her glove compartment, about food assistance, about vaccinations, about school buses and dental clinics. She sounded like the paper they were printed on, flat, thin, insufficient. Leaves rustled. Something or someone moved, shadow on shadow. Angela stepped away from the car, boots sinking an inch into the wet road, craning her neck to see up the slope. For a heartbeat, she caught a flash of pale skin, not bark. A bare arm withdrawing behind a trunk. Fingers longer than they should have been curled on the rough surface. Then it was gone. The instinct to chase it warred with the instinct to get back in the car and lock the doors. Her training won. Barely. "I know you're there," she said more quietly. "I'm not leaving until I've at least said hello. My car's stuck." She almost added, "I could use a hand, like they were neighbors instead of strangers in a place locals wouldn't name." The voice that answered was not a child's. "Car's stuck 'cause road don't want you." It came from above her, flat and matter-of-fact, every syllable sanded down by an accent that belonged to a place where vowels took their time. A man's voice, but younger than she'd expected, teen or early 20s. "Road tells us when someone's comin' that don't belong." Angela swallowed, eyes tracing the slope until she found him. He stood half a dozen yards up, one shoulder against a tree as casual as if he were leaning on a porch post. He was thin but not wasted, muscles like rope under skin tanned by weather more than sun. His hair hung to his jaw in an unkempt curtain, greasy at the roots. His clothes, if you could call them that, were a mismatch of decades, a flannel shirt gone threadbare at the cuffs, army surplus pants cinched with twine, boots held together with duct tape. The bones she'd seen earlier, the wind chime on the branch hung from a leather thong at his throat, rattling softly when he breathed. She lifted her hands, palms out the way they'd taught her. No sudden moves. "You live up here?" He didn't answer the question. His gaze slid past her, to the logo on her car door, to the license plate, to the neat stack of forms visible through the windshield. Something in his jaw shifted. "You with them?" he said. Not a question, a verdict. "State." "I work with families," she said. "If there's kids up here, I can help get food, medicine, school." At the word school, his mouth twisted, a flash of something like contempt. "Ain't no school up here." He pushed away from the tree, dropped lightly down the slope, moved closer until she could smell him. Smoke, damp earth, something feral under that. He stopped just out of arm's reach. "You're gonna turn that car around and go back down." "I can't," she said, gesturing to the sunk front end. "I'd be happy to, but I'm stuck until a tow gets here. And they won't come if I can't tell them exactly where." "They won't come," he interrupted. "Phone don't work past the bridge. Radios don't neither. That's how we keep it." His eyes flicked to the bone charm at his chest, then back to her. "You don't drive where the mountain says stop." There it was, the thing she'd heard in so many people's voices since she'd taken this job. The sense that the land itself had opinions. She could have laughed. She didn't. Instead, she said, "You've had people come up here before." He shrugged one shoulder, a twitch that said, "Yes, and we're still here." "Sheriff?" she probed. "Game warden." His gaze slid away in a way that said too many questions. "We take care of our own." "Do you have kids?" she asked, shifting tactics. "I've had calls about children. I need to see them, make sure they're safe." At that, something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear, not guilt. Protectiveness, sharp and animal. "Kids are safe 'cause they ain't in town," he said. "You take 'em down there, they get sick. They eat your food, breathe your smoke, learn to forget." He shook his head, a small, almost pitying motion. "They belong to the hill, not to you." The way he said belong slid under her skin like a splinter. She'd heard similar words from foster parents who thought paperwork gave them more claim on a child than blood, from state officials who talked about inventory instead of people. Hearing it here in the mouth of someone the sheriff would have called a feral made her jaw tighten. "The law says—" "The law's down there." He jerked his chin toward the smear of civilization out of sight beyond the trees. "Up here, there's us and there's the mountain. We answer to one." "Which?" she asked before she could stop herself. He smiled then. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Whichever's older." Behind him in the undergrowth, something moved. More than one something. Figures uncurled from shadows, women, children, old men. They'd been there the whole time, Angela realized, invisible until they chose not to be. All of them bore some version of the same bone charms, the same leather and twine, the same patchwork of cast-off clothes and handmade pieces. Their faces were lean, eyes too bright. Not starving, not wild in the way of lost sick animals, wild in the way of something that has deliberately stepped outside. Angela's training told her to retreat. Too many unknowns, alone, outnumbered, no backup. But another thought rose, quieter and more treacherous. If you leave now, they go back underground. No one sees them again until it's worse. Until a kid dies. until something happens that ends up as a line item in a coroner's report instead of a conversation you could have now. "My name is Angela," she said, voice steadying. "What's yours?" He hesitated, then said, "Rhett." It sounded like a name chosen rather than given, something he'd picked up and kept because it fit in his mouth. "You ain't writing it down." Her hand, which had been inching toward her notepad, stopped. Slowly, deliberately, she let it fall away. "All right, no notes, just talking." She looked past him at the cluster of people watching. A girl of maybe 8 peeked from behind a woman's skirt, hair matted into tight braids threaded with small bones instead of beads. A boy of 12, skinny but sharp-eyed, clutched a rabbit by its hind legs, freshly killed, blood still dripping from its nose. An old woman sat on a low rock, a bundle of herbs in her lap, fingers stained green. Their gazes were all the same, measuring. "Talk fast, then," Rhett said. "Sun's dropping." As if in answer, the light slipped a little lower between the trunks, shadows lengthening. The air, already cool, took on a damp edge that hinted at the kind of cold that seeps into joints. Angela glanced at the car, at the useless wheels, then back at Rhett. "Will you at least help me get out of here?" He considered, then shook his head. "You stay till it's done." "What's done?" "Harvest." She thought stupidly of corn and pumpkins, of county fairs and hay rides. Then she saw the way the older woman's hands tightened on her herb bundle and knew he didn't mean crops. "Every fall," he said, seeing the question on her face. "When the leaves go red, when the animals go skinny, when you lot down there start talking about the time change. We go up to the high place and we give back." He gestured at the bone chime above her. "You all take what you want, always have. Trees, coal, gas, men. We take what we need. Difference is we pay for it. You don't." Angela's mouth went dry. "Pay how?" "You'll see. There's a moment in every case where you decide whether you're going to be the kind of worker who sticks strictly to the manual or the kind who steps over the line." Angela realized, standing there in the mud on a road the county map barely acknowledged, that she'd already stepped. She could insist on leaving. She could scream. She could try to push past Rhett and his quiet, watching people and hike back toward the gas station, hoping the mountain didn't simply eat the road behind her. Or she could go forward into whatever harvest meant and witness it. "You bring your kids?" she heard herself ask, glancing at the girl with the bone-threaded braids. "To this harvest?" He nodded once. "Everybody comes. Everybody sees. So everybody remembers why we don't go down." They led her off the road, on a path she wouldn't have seen alone. A barely there trail through laurel and rock, switchbacking up until the car, the road, even the idea of pavement felt like another life. Roots reached for her ankles. Branches clawed at her coat. Once something large moved away through the trees ahead, a deer or a bear. But no one flinched. The further they climbed, the more signs she saw that this was no aimless camp of people hiding from the law. There were woven screens of branches shaped into rough fences. Lashings of vine that had been laid deliberately to trip anything that walked heavy and didn't know where to step. Small flat stones set in patterns at the base of certain trees, each dusted with what looked uncomfortably like ash. The high place turned out not to be a peak, but a shelf of rock that jutted from the mountainside, overlooking 3 converging hollers. From up there, as the last light slanted in bloody streaks across the ridges, Angela could see evidence of the life she was supposed to be assessing. Low camouflage shelters tucked into the slope, smoke that hugged the ground instead of rising in plumes, the faint glint of water in carefully lined channels. It was a whole community threaded through the forest like mycelium, dense, hidden, interconnected. Not mindless, not accidental, chosen. At the center of the rock shelf stood what at first glance looked like a scarecrow. It was man-shaped, arms outstretched, head bowed. As Angela's eyes adjusted, she saw it was made of bones, long femurs lashed together for limbs, ribs woven into a crude cage for a torso, a bleached skull perched on top, jaw wired shut with rusted fence. The empty sockets gazed down toward the hollers like a sentinel. Strips of leather hung from its arms, each threaded with small bones, teeth, and little bundles of dried herbs. The smell up here was stronger. Smoke, yes, but under it something mineral and metallic, like old blood scrubbed clean but never quite gone. The community spread out in a loose circle around the effigy, children at the front, adults behind. Angela stood on the edge, heart pounding, acutely aware of the weight of her badge in her pocket, of the fact that no one outside this ring knew where she was. The sky above darkened from bruised purple to deep blue. First one, then a dozen stars winked on. In the hollow silence between bird calls and the rise of night insects, the old woman from below stepped forward, bones in her braids clicking softly. She began to speak. It wasn't English, not at first. Or if it had been once, it had warped, worn smooth by generations. Syllables eroded into something that fit the shape of this place better than flat vowels and hard consonants. The cadence, though, was unmistakable. Invocation, account, bargaining. As she talked, the people around her answered at certain points with a low, unified hum, not words, but assent. Even the children joined, small voices weaving under the adults like roots under trunks. Angela didn't understand the precise content, but she understood the bones of it, listing what had been taken that year: trees, water, animals, air. The sickness that had come down from the mines, from the factories, from the highways. The men who'd gone to war and come back ghosts in their own kitchens. The babies who'd been born with lungs that rattled on the first breath. All of it laid at the feet of something older than any of them. Good century of stone and root and night. When the old woman reached a certain refrain, one that made the hairs on Angela's arms stand up even though she couldn't parse a single word, a young man stepped out of the circle. He was about Rhett's age, maybe a few years older, hair shorn close, arms crisscrossed with scars that were too straight to be accidents. He carried a burlap sack over one shoulder. Without looking at anyone else, he went up to the bone figure and knelt. From the sack, he drew out offerings one by one. A deer skull, antlers still attached, a bundle of feathers bound with red thread, a small, carefully wrapped parcel that, when he opened it, released the stench of something that had been dead long enough to go sweet. He laid each at the base of the effigy, murmuring words Angela couldn't hear over the pounding in her ears. "Last year," Rhett murmured at her side, voice low. "We didn't give enough." She realized he was speaking to her alone, a running translation for the outsider who would never be invited here again. "What happens if you don't?" she whispered back, because fear made fools of people and some part of her still thought maybe this was shadow play. Just old religion dressed up in bones and smoke. He didn't answer. He just nodded toward the far holler. In the dying light, Angela saw something she'd missed before. A swath of forest where the trees were all dead. Not cut, not logged, standing. Gray trunks, bare branches, leaves gone not with the season but with something else. The ground beneath them was choked with undergrowth that had withered in place, a frozen wave of brambles. Even from this distance it looked wrong, like a wound that had never healed. "Spring." "Nothing grew there," Rhett said. "Calves born without eyes. Water went bad for a spell. You think that's from your people?" He jerked his chin toward the distant twinkle of a highway. "That's this place reminding us it can take more than it gives." The old woman's voice rose, climbing in pitch and intensity. The children fell silent. A wind shifted, cold and deliberate, cutting through the gathered like a knife. The bone chimes on the effigy's arms began to move, clacking together with a sound that set Angela's teeth on edge. The man at its feet reached into the sack one last time. When his hand came out, he was holding something small and pale that wriggled weakly, a rabbit, its front legs bound. He cradled it, whispered against its fur, then, with a speed that spoke of long practice, broke its neck. The cracks seemed to echo off the surrounding stone. He laid the still twitching body among the other offerings, blood dripping onto rock that, Angela realized with a lurch, was already stained a darker shade than the rest of the shelf. The group's hum shifted, dropped into a note so low she felt it in her stomach. The air grew thick. Angela's vision swam at the edges, as if the night itself were pressing against her eyes. For a heartbeat, it felt like the rock under her feet moved, a slow, sinking exhale, as though something deep below had accepted what lay on its surface. "Sometimes we give more," Rhett said into her ear. The implication hit her harder than the cold. She pictured old newspaper clippings, missing hunters, lost hikers, a drifter whose burned-out van had been found at a trailhead but whose body never turned up. Stories she'd half heard in briefing rooms, the sort of thing people in town said with a shrug and the words, "mountains took 'em." The phrase had always sounded romantic, fatalistic. Standing here with bone and blood under her boots, it sounded like a transaction. "You kill people," she said too loud, the words ripped from somewhere between anger and terror. Heads turned, the chant faltered. Rhett's gaze snapped to her, hard. "We don't touch kids," he said. "Don't touch our own. But there's always ones you push up here." "Push?" He took a step closer, and for the first time that day she saw real fury in him. Not the scorn of someone being judged from a world they'd rejected, but the hot, sharp anger of someone tired of being blamed for other people's dirt. Men who do things down there and walk. Men who got papers saying they're fine when everybody knows they ain't. You move 'em on. You send 'em someplace quiet to cool off. He mimed quotation marks with his fingers. They wander up. They always do. We don't hunt 'em. We just show 'em to the hill. Hill decides. Angela thought of case files she'd seen shuffled into transferred piles. Of a man who'd hurt every foster child in the 3-county radius and had been quietly relocated instead of prosecuted because no one wanted a trial. Of rumors, unspoken but known, about a certain holler where problem cases ended up and never came back on the books. Her stomach turned. "You can't," she began. "We can't what?" he cut in. "We can't do what you do with a piece of paper and a bus ticket?" He shook his head. "Difference is we stay and listen when they scream." The old woman's voice rose to a sharp, cutting note. The argument between Angela and Rhett dissolved under it like sugar in hot water. The gathered turned back to the effigy. Angela stood on the edge, heart battering her ribs, every sense straining. For a moment the world seemed to narrow to the circle of bone, and bodies to the smells of smoke and copper, and damp leaves to the feel of the mountain under her soles. Nothing obvious happened. There was no lightning, no fissure opening to swallow the offerings. The rock did not bleed. But as the chant wound down, as the final low note shuddered into silence, Angela actually felt, the pressure in the air ease. Her ears popped, like on an airplane descent. The wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the scent of wet earth instead of old iron. Somewhere in the distance an owl called, quick and bright. The children began to whisper among themselves, the spell broken. The old woman exhaled, shoulders dropping, and wiped a streak of blood from the stone with the heel of her hand, pressing it into a faint smear like a signature. "That's it?" Angela asked, voice small in the aftermath. "That's enough," Rhett said. "For this year." They went back down in near dark, feet sure on the invisible path. By the time they reached the road, full night had fallen. Stars burned cold between the branches. Angela's car sat where she'd left it, hood splattered with mud, one headlight catching the glint of the bone triangle on the poplar. For a panicked moment, she imagined it would be gone, swallowed whole as some final lesson. Instead, Rhett walked past her without a word, grabbed the front bumper with both hands and heaved. The car groaned, rocked, then with a sucking sound popped free of the rut. He let go, stepped back, breathing only a little harder than usual. "Road says you can go now," he said. She stared at him. "Why?" she asked. It wasn't the most diplomatic question, but subtlety had long since bled out of the day. "Why show me any of that? Why not run me off at the bridge?" He shrugged, rubbing mud from his palms onto his pants. "'Cause you'll talk," he said. "You'll go down there and you'll tell them some story so they can stamp it and file it and feel like they done something." His gaze met hers, steady. "They won't believe the parts that matter, but you will." Angela swallowed. "What if I send people back up?" His smile was a flash of teeth in the dark. "We'll know." He tapped the bone charm at his throat. "Hill'll know. And if you send up the wrong kind, well, that's your part of the bargain." She drove back down in a daze, the wipers smearing thin mud across the windshield, the road seeming both too long and not nearly long enough to put distance between her and what she'd seen. At the gas station, the attendant looked up as she pulled in, eyes flicking to the muck on her bumper, the wild set of her shoulders. "You made it farther than most," he said quietly, no trace of mockery. Back at the office, under buzzing fluorescent lights, the file on her desk sat waiting, thin and inadequate. In her report, she wrote words like non-compliant population, voluntary isolation, no evidence of acute child endangerment at this time. Phrases that checked boxes and soothed supervisors. She did not mention bone effigies or blood on rock shelves or the way the mountain had seemed to breathe when the offerings were laid down. In the margin, in a note only she would ever read again, she scribbled one sentence. "They are not lost. They have walked away." Years later, long after she'd left that job for something safer, she still sometimes woke at 3 in the morning with the phantom taste of iron in her mouth and the echo of bone chimes in her ears. Every few winters, a headline would cross her path. "Hiker missing in National Forest. Search called off. Parolee fails to report. Last seen heading into hills," and she would feel that old chill uncoil in her spine. She never went back to Lick Run. She never sent anyone else there. But on certain cold autumn nights, when the first frost silvered the lawns in town and the smoke from chimneys hung low, she would stand on her porch, look up at the dark line of the ridge, and think of the people living by a different calendar, under a different law. People who, every fall, still climbed to a shelf of rock with bones in their hands and bargains on their tongues, making sure that when the mountain took, it at least remembered who was pushing its debts from below. Story 7. The Bell Witch's Last Heir. By the time Daniel Bell realized something in the cave knew his name, the flashlight in his shaking hand was already dying, its beam shrinking to a weak yellow tunnel that barely reached the next bend of wet stone. Robertson County, Tennessee outside looked like any other hot summer night. Cicadas screaming in the trees, humidity hanging thick over the fields, the low glow of distant porch lights across the dark Cumberland River. Down here, under the old Bell farm, the air was cold enough to make his breath plume in front of his face. The cave's mouth yawned behind him like a smaller patch of darkness inside the general dark, and for the first time in his 34 years he understood why his grandfather had always told him, half joking and half not, "You can walk any field on this land you want, boy, but you don't go in that cave. She lives in there." As a kid, she had been a story, a word that meant nothing more than Halloween fun. The Bell Witch. The family curse. The old legend about some frontier poltergeist that hated one man so much it killed him and stuck around to brag about it. As an adult, a paramedic used to blood and wrecks and real emergencies, Daniel thought he'd left that fear in childhood. Then the stone under his boot shifted, the beam jumped, and from somewhere ahead in the black, a woman's voice said in a bright, clear tone that sounded much too close, "Danny boy, took you long enough." He froze, every muscle locking. No one called him that anymore. His grandfather had once, in a voice stained with tobacco and stories, but he'd been dead for 6 months now, laid in the family cemetery under an oak whose roots had known every bell since John himself. Daniel swallowed, throat dry. "Who's there?" he called, immediately hating how small his voice sounded against the stone. The sound bounced back to him in thin echoes. "This is private property. You need to come out." It was the kind of thing he'd say on a welfare check, automatic, a script. The cave did not care about scripts. "Private," the voice repeated, amused. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, not muffled by a rock the way it should have been. It was a woman's voice, yes, but not the trembling, aged tone he'd half expected from the stories. No cracked crone mutters or Hollywood cackles. This voice was mid-30s, sharp, with a local accent that flattened certain vowels and turned there into thar. "Boy, you're a bell standing on bell land over my bones, and you're gonna talk to me about private." A low chuckle rolled along the walls. Behind him at the cave mouth, the night insects went abruptly silent, as if someone had slammed a door on the outside world. 20 minutes earlier, the cave had been nothing but a dare. He'd driven out to the old farm because he couldn't stand the sound of the house anymore. His grandfather's cough echoing in the kitchen, the ghost impressions left by furniture the lawyers had hauled away. His own name in the mouth of distant cousins wanting to know what he was going to do with all that famous haunted land. More than once a stranger had stopped him in town to ask if he'd ever heard her, like the witch was some tourist attraction he could ring up at will. He'd smiled, said no, said he didn't put much stock in campfire tales. Privately, though, grief and anger had twisted together in his gut. If there was a curse on this family, he thought, sitting in his empty living room, it wasn't a witch. It was that story clinging to their name so hard that even his grandfather's obituary had mentioned the Bell Witch before it mentioned his years in the Navy. So when the sun sank and the heat broke a little, he'd grabbed a flashlight and driven the rutted track down to the river. The Bell Witch Cave sat in a low limestone bluff, its mouth half hidden by vines and the drooping branches of a sycamore. The local historical society gave tours of it during the day, complete with electric lights and guide patter about the time Andrew Jackson supposedly refused to camp nearby because something unseen spooked his horses. Tonight the parking area was empty, the gate at the path's entrance hanging open, the metal sign that said, "No admittance after 6 p.m. rattling in a faint breeze. The rational part of him said it was locked up farther down, near the mouth. The part of him that had grown up on his grandfather's stories wondered if it mattered. Inside, the air changed immediately. Summer dropped off his shoulders like a coat. The stone walls, slick with condensation, squeezed in close, then opened into a wider chamber lit only by his handheld beam. His boots splashed in shallow, cold water. He walked slow, one hand trailing along the rough wall, feeling his way around familiar shapes from daytime TV ghost specials. The low tunnel where kids crawled to hear whispers, the tall, piano rock crowds said she danced on. During tours, people reported being pushed, pinched, hearing laughter. Daniel heard only his own breathing and the steady drip of water from some unseen stalactite. It took 5 minutes for his shoulders to unclench. Ghost stories, he thought, edging the beam along a wall marked with decades of carved initials. That's all. He just reached the back of the main chamber when the batteries in his flashlight flickered. The beam dimmed, brightened, then shrunk to a sickly halo. "Oh, come on," he muttered, thumping the casing with his palm. He'd grabbed it from his truck without checking and now cursed himself for the oversight. The darkness thickened around him, turning the cave's angles into a waiting black. He pivoted to go back, picking his way carefully. His foot slipped on algae-slick rock. The beam swung wild. In that moment of disorientation, the voice slid into the space between his pulse beats. "Danny boy!" It wasn't in his ears. It was behind them, curled against the bone. For a split second, every hair on his body tried to stand up at once. He whipped the fading light around, heart pounding, mouth going dry. The beam caught only stone and water. "Who's there?" he asked, hating the tremor that tagged along at the end of the question. "I liked the old names better," the voice said conversationally, as if they were two people meeting at a church potluck. "John, Betsy. They had some spine to 'em, but I suppose a curse has to keep up with the times." Something moved in the edge of his vision, a pale smear against the darker rock. He swung the beam toward it, slow, not wanting to see and needing to anyway. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the light picked out a handprint on the wall. It hadn't been there before. It was small, the size of a teenage girl's, fingers splayed as if pressed hard into the slimy stone. As he watched, water trickled down over it, but the shape didn't blur. It darkened, the edges thickening, as if whatever had made it was bleeding through from the other side. "Them bells," the voice went on, "always did like to pretend their troubles started with me. That I came out of nowhere one night and ruined their good Christian life." A pause, as if she were savoring a memory. "Truth is, I didn't walk into their house till they called me. Folks around here think speaking a thing's name gives it power. They're right. Your people gave me mine." He knew the history as well as anyone. In the early 1800s, John Bell, patriarch of the frontier farm, had supposedly tangled with a neighbor woman named Kate Batts over a land deal. He'd cheated her, depending on who told the story, called her a witch, said she was cursed. Not long after, something in his house started knocking, scratching, talking. It slapped his daughter, pulled her hair, sang hymns in a voice that wasn't anyone's throat. It spoke from the walls, from the floor, from the air. It knew things it shouldn't know, private conversations, distant sermons, repeated word for word. It hated John. It whispered that it would kill him. In 1820, he died with a mysterious vial of black liquid beside his bed, and the disembodied voice laughed at his funeral. Folks came from counties over to hear the witch argue scripture and report on the poltergeist that called itself Kate. Over 200 years later, Tennessee still had the only death certificate in the country that bluntly listed supernatural as a factor. Daniel had grown up hearing all of this. He'd walked through the old Bell cabin replica on field trips, run his fingers along the splintered replica bed where John was said to have died, stood in the cave while a guide killed the lanterns and asked the dark if Kate wanted to speak. Nothing had ever happened to him. Part of him had felt almost left out. Now, in the failing cone of his own weak flashlight, he understood the luxury of being ignored. "I don't believe in you," he said, because it was the only weapon he had that felt remotely sharp. His voice echoed too loud. "You're a story, a way for this town to sell t-shirts. You're a line item on your granddaddy's medical chart," the voice cut in. The handprint on the wall twitched. Another appeared a foot higher, fingers curled this time as if gripping. "A joke they put on your family's brochures? Come see the cursed farm. How'd that feel, Danny boy, sitting in that hospital, hearing nurses giggle about your name right outside the curtain?" His throat closed. He'd never told anyone about that. Not the way it had made the back of his neck burn to hear two techs whisper, "You know that's a bell, right? like the witch bell. Not the way he'd wanted to tear the name tag off his grandfather's wrist and toss it in the trash. "Lucky you," one of them had said, half joking. "Least you know who killed your kin first." "You weren't there," he said hoarsely. "Child, I've been there since before they put the first stone over John's grave," she said. The handprints multiplied, a slow, blooming rash along the wall, each one the same size, each one pressed into existence by nothing he could see. "I was in the room when he choked on his own tongue. I was on the porch when Betsy cried herself sick over that boy she couldn't marry 'cause I wouldn't let her sleep. I was sitting on the headboard when your granddaddy's heart gave up. I waited in the corners for you too, but they had you out of that house as soon as you could walk. You think a town like this lets the witch get close to the baby hero of the story?" He realized he was backing up only when his heel hit something that wasn't stone. He glanced down. The beam skated over a pile of small, stubby candles melted into the rock, their wicks black. Wax puddled onto the floor in dripped layers like stalagmites. Old offerings from tourists, maybe. "Please make something happen," the tags at the gift shop had said. "Be careful what you ask for," he thought, hysteria fluttering at the edge of his mind. "What do you want?" he asked. She laughed, and the sound bounced off every surface, loud and delighted and terrible. "Want? Oh boy. You talk like this is a wishes and fishes kind of deal. Like I'm some fairy you can bargain with. That's your problem, you bells. You always thought you were making deals when really you were just getting heard." The flashlight flickered again. The circle of light shrank to the size of a dinner plate, then a saucer. Panic clawed up his throat. He smacked the end of the torch with his palm, begging the batteries for just a few more seconds. The beam stuttered on, weak but there. "You came down here," she went on, "'cause you're mad. Mad he left you with a story instead of money. Mad your name gets used to. Sell ghost tours while you're picking up double shifts to pay his bills. Mad nobody remembers he was a man who liked bad bluegrass and snored loud enough to shake the walls. They just remember he was one of the bells." The last words dripped scorn. "You want to know if there's someone to blame for that? Someone to swing at? You want to know if I'm real enough to hit?" Something brushed the back of his neck. Light, barely there, like a fingertip. He jerked away, nearly dropping the flashlight. The beam swung wild, caught, for just an instant, a pattern in the condensation on the opposite wall that looked like letters. They spelled his last name. Bell. Written in water, the droplets beating along invisible lines as if someone had traced the word with a cold finger. As he watched, another word appeared underneath, the strokes jagged, impatient. "Mine." His breathing turned into shallow gasps. "If you wanted me so bad," he said, voice shaking, "why wait?" "I ain't a dog on a chain," she said, offended. "I don't come running every time somebody drags my name out for a Halloween party. I come when the wait's right." Her tone shifted, softened mockingly. "You know how many times since 1820 folks have called me, tried to use me as some excuse? Wasn't my fault, the Bell Witch made me do it. Wasn't me screaming at my kids, that's the curse talking. You frail little things loving outside evil means nothing's ever your fault." A long pause. "But your people knew better. At first." The flashlight gave one last pathetic flicker and died. Darkness slammed down around him like a physical blow. For a heartbeat, he saw after-images of the cave burned into his retinas. The slick walls, the low ceiling, the smear of handprints. Then even that ghost light faded, leaving him in a black so complete it felt thick. His breath sounded too loud. His own heartbeat roared in his ears. For the first time in years, he felt a raw, childlike urge to cry out for someone else, His grandfather, his mother, anybody, but the only name that came to his lips was hers. Kate. The air shivered. There now, she said softly. Honesty. He took one staggered step, hands groping for the wall. His fingertips brushed damp stone, then slipped through. Nothing. For one vertiginous second, his hand passed into a space that felt colder than anything he'd ever known. An absence of air, of substance like the cavity inside a skull. He yanked it back with a strangled sound, fingers numb. The cave around him seemed to breathe in, a long, slow inhalation. You know what I was before your people got a hold of me? She asked. He could hear her more clearly now, not because she'd grown louder, but because the rest of the world had fallen away. It was just her voice and the sound of water dripping somewhere behind him. I was every wrong thing they whispered about their neighbors. I was the way men spat Kate's name when she talked too loud in church. I was the look on John's face when he thought nobody saw how small he'd made her world. A sharp intake of breath that wasn't quite a sigh. I was mean gossip turned to meat. You fed me with your disgust, your fear, your little pleasures when bad things happened to people you didn't like. You named me. You talked to me every night in that house. Oh, that Kate, you said. Oh, that witch. And then you acted surprised when something in the walls started answering. In the dark, Daniel felt a flicker of scenes that weren't his. The rough-hewn interior of a log cabin, firelight painting the walls, a girl with braids crying into a pillow, a man gasping, lips blue, while a spoonful of bitter liquid dribbled down his chin. A woman's hand, calloused, knuckles chapped, curling into a fist as men turned their backs on her at a church door. Under it all, a steady growing hum of voices, gossip stacked on gossip until it took on weight. Then what are you now? He asked, voice small. There was a pause. When she answered, the flippancy had thinned. Habit, she said, story. Echo. A hint of sharp teeth slipped back into her tone. And a promise kept. I told him I'd be back when there were bells that needed reminding. Reminding of what? That you can't keep feeding me and then pretend you don't know my face, she snapped. That every time your lot drags me out to scare children, every time a man down there blames me for his poison instead of owning it, I get just a shade clearer. He heard the skitter of something along the floor. Pebbles maybe, or bone. Your granddaddy knew that. That's why he wouldn't say my name in that house. He told you stories about me, sure, but he always ended them with, "Don't you go calling on her, boy, you listen." Daniel thought back, pulse pounding. It was true. In all those nights on the porch, the old man had spoken about the witch in a third-person way, never addressing her directly, never repeating the famous taunts people in town like to mimic. If anyone else on a tour asked, "Is that you, Kate?" he'd gone quiet. "You don't poke a bear that's already eaten someone in your family," he'd said once, half under his breath. "So why me?" Daniel forced out. "I never asked for you. I never wanted this damn story. I left. I lived in Nashville, Memphis, didn't come back till he got sick. You had 200 years' worth of bells to pick from." "Child," she said, weary and amused all at once. "You think this is about want?" Something brushed past him in the dark. Not rough, gentle almost, like the trailing edge of a skirt. The air around his knees moved. The smell of river water and old cold ash washed over him, overlaying the mineral scent of stone. He held very still. "You're the first one in a long time to come down here alone without a preacher, a camera, or a gaggle of thrill-seekers," she said. "You came mad and empty-handed. You didn't want proof. You wanted answer. That's closer to how it started than anything I've seen in 100 years." The faintest touch skimmed the underside of his jaw, an almost affectionate tap. "Besides, you're the last one who still gives a damn about what your name means. Others use it. You carry it." His eyes burned. To his shame, he felt tears pushing up. "It's ruined everything," he said. The admission ripped out more than offered. "Every job interview, every date, all they want to talk about is you. They turn my family into a ghost tour footnote and then look at me like I'm supposed to be proud." "And?" she asked softly. "And I hate you for it," he snapped. The word echoed ugly in the close air. "I hate that I know the story of a man who died 2 centuries ago better than I know my own father. I hate that he drank himself to death trying to live up to being a belle, whatever that means. I hate that Granddad had to sell pieces of this land to pay medical bills while strangers made money selling your face on shot glasses." His voice cracked. "I hate that I care." Silence folded around them, thick and heavy. For a long moment, the only sound was water dripping in some deep pocket of the earth. Then, to his surprise, she laughed. It wasn't the cruel, showy cackle of the ghost tour stories. It was a low, satisfied chuckle, like someone hearing the punchline they'd been waiting on. "There it is," she said. "Honest hate, not that painted-up fear you folks like to parade around. That's what feeds me, not the tours, not the T-shirts, the little mean truths you don't say out loud." He swallowed. "So what now?" Now? There was movement in front of him, the sense of someone stepping closer, though the air stayed stubbornly cold. "Now I tell you something and you listen." The dark pressed in. He listened. "You're right," she said. "Your kin made me. Your town keeps me. They use my name to sell you and then act shocked when the story bites. But here's the part you don't like sitting with. You use me, too." "I don't—" "You do," she cut in. "Every time you shrug and say curse when what you mean is my daddy chose the bottle. Every time you say witch when what you mean is this place is mean to poor folks and always has been. Every time you sit in that house and let my story stand in for 100 years of bad choices because it's easier to hate a ghost than to hate people you loved." The words hit like blows. He opened his mouth to protest, to deny, but the images that rose unbidden stopped him. His father slumped at the kitchen table, saying, "It's in the blood, son. Men in this family don't die in bed of old age." His grandfather, "Joking? Reckon I'll go the way of John yet. Better keep an eye on my medicine." Himself blaming a bell temper when he snapped at co-workers as if anger were a curse instead of something he could choose to control. "So you came down here," she said, "hoping I'd be real enough for you to point at and say, 'Her. She did it'? You wanted a monster. I'll play the part, I'm good at it. But it don't change where I came from." His legs shook. He sat down hard on the cold stone, heedless of the water soaking through his jeans. The dark didn't lift. If anything, it seemed to grow more intimate, folding closer. Weirdly, the terror ebbed a little, replaced by something raw and ugly but familiar. Shame. "If you hate us so much," he whispered, "why stick around?" "Who says I hate you?" she replied. "I enjoy you." A pause. "You're loud, messy, full of contradictions. You keep feeding me without even meaning to. Little town like this shouldn't have birthed a story that made it into court records, into books, into people's mouths 2 centuries later. But it did. That kind of staying power, that's a kind of worship." He almost laughed, a broken sound. "So this is... what? A sermon?" "Call it a family meeting," she said, amused. "You're the last bell on this land. When you go, all that's left here with my name on it is a sign and a cave. The others scattered, married out, changed their names, pretended they were something else. You came back. That deserves a word." "What word?" She was quiet for a long beat. When she spoke next, her tone had gone flat, flint hard. "Leave." He blinked into the dark. "What?" "Sell the house," she said. "Sell the fields, the tours, the damn cave if you can find someone fool enough. Take their money. Go somewhere with no bells and no witches. Change your name if you have to. Let this patch of dirt remember me and John and Betsy and all the rest without having to remember you too." A faint, bitter smile crept into her voice. "You're the first one smart enough to hate the story and not just wallow in it. Don't waste that on being a mascot." Anger flared through the fear and shame, quick and hot. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he snapped. "You talk about people using you, but you've been using us just as much. You think I'm gonna let you outlive every bell and stand here alone with your name and nobody left to argue with it?" The cave made a sound he felt more than heard, a long, low vibration that rattled his teeth. For a second, he thought the whole ceiling was about to come down. Then it stopped as abruptly as it had started. "Oh, Danny boy," she said, and there was something like fondness in it, twisted and sharp. "You think you're my anchor? I've got my hooks in this whole county. I'm in the way they talk about women who know too much. I'm in every joke about mountain curses when a bad man gets what he had coming. I'm in the way tourists take pictures of that cave sign like it means they were brave. You can't starve me out by walking away. You can, however, stop giving me your backbone to chew on." He sat there, shaking in the dark, the weight of 2 centuries of rumor and fear and fascination pressing down on his shoulders. The idea of leaving, really leaving, not just driving into town for a shift and back out, had always felt like betrayal. Like abandoning his grandfather, like letting the worst parts of the story win. Now, with her voice curling around his bones, it felt like something else. Survival. "How do I know," he said slowly, "that if I go, you won't just follow?" Another laugh. "You're not special," she said. "Not that way. I don't trail folks to Nashville. I don't ride along to Florida condos. I'm a house haunt boy, a land thing. I stay where they made me, where they keep calling me. You walk away, I'll still be here, whispering to whatever poor fool buys that place that they got themselves a piece of real American folklore." A note of vicious glee. "Maybe they'll deserve it more than you." He thought of realtors' smiles, of historic property listings, of some vacation home flipper pitching "Live on the famous Bell Witch Farm" to out-of-state buyers with more money than sense. The thought should have filled him with dread, for them, for the land. Instead, he felt only a bone-deep exhaustion. Let someone else carry it, he thought. Let someone who wanted the story so bad they'd pay for it have it. "You killed him," he said suddenly, the words blurting out before he could stop them. "John, you killed John. Did you—" His voice shrank. "Did you kill my grandfather?" A long, low breath in the dark. "I warned John," she said. "Told him for 3 years I was gonna. Man ignored me, called me names, kept right on as he was. I was more honest with him than most of his neighbors ever were." A pause. "Your granddaddy?" I sat on the headboard and watched. Old hearts go. That's what they do. You want me to claim that too, so you don't have to sit with the fact that sometimes life just hurts. He flinched. "I didn't pour the poison down John's throat," she went on. "I just didn't move the bottle." It was not an answer that would satisfy a court. It satisfied something older and uglier in him. The part that had wanted there to be intent behind every bad thing, because intent could be argued with. Randomness could not. "Why tell me to leave if you want to keep eating?" he asked quietly. "'Cause I'm old," she said matter-of-factly. "And old things get bored. Your line's been good theater. I'd like to see what happens when the story gets loose from the people who made it. That's a new kind of mischief." Another shift in the air, closer. "And maybe," she added almost too low to hear, "one less bell on this dirt means one less person I have to watch teach their kid to be scared of things that started out as their own damn shadow." A hand, cool, not cold, settled for an instant on the top of his head. Not the clammy slap he'd imagined, a weight brief and startlingly human. He sucked in a sharp breath. "That's my blessing," she said, and he could hear the grin in it. "Far as you're concerned, consider the curse redirected." Before he could ask what that meant, the world lurched. The floor under him tilted just enough to make his stomach flip. A wind he couldn't explain buffeted his face, not from the cave mouth but from deeper within, rushing past him as if something had just exhaled. The silence shattered. Crickets screamed outside. A frog croaked somewhere near the river. The drip of water grew noisy, insistent. His ears popped. The flashlight in his hand flared back to life. For a second, the beam was blinding. He squinted, throwing up a hand. When his eyes adjusted, he found himself sitting not in the center of the chamber, but near the entrance, one boot half in the shallows of the river that ran just outside the cave mouth. Behind him, the cavern yawned black and quiet, no handprints on the visible walls, no candles, no carved words. The face of his watch glowed a weak green. He'd been inside, according to its hands, for less than 10 minutes. It felt like hours. He staggered to his feet, legs trembling. The hot night air was a shock as he stepped out from under the rock overhang. Tree frogs shrilled. Fireflies winked over the water like tiny oblivious souls. Above, the house lights on the hill looked small and dim and very, very far away. On the drive back up, the ruts in the farm road felt deeper, more treacherous. Twice he had to correct for a slide of gravel. Each time his heart jumped into his throat. When he stepped onto the porch of the old house, the boards creaked in their familiar way. The screen door squealed. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the ghost of his grandfather's cologne and the fried chicken grease from the last meal they'd eaten together at this table. He walked through every room, looking at it with new eyes. Not as an heir, as a man appraising a place to sell. Cracks in the ceiling, floors that needed sanding, the big oak out front whose roots were slowly lifting the foundation. The framed print of some artist's impression of the Bell Witch on the wall, wild hair, claws, etc., that a distant cousin had gifted them one Christmas as a joke. He took it down, set it face down on a chair. In the back bedroom, the one that had been his as a boy, the mirror over the dresser caught his reflection. For a heartbeat, he didn't recognize himself. Pale, eyes too wide, a smear of mud on his cheek. Behind his shoulder, in the reflection only, a woman stood in the doorway. Not the horror movie, hag of tourist brochures. A plain frontier woman in a simple dress, hair pulled back, eyes dark. Her face was neither kind nor cruel, appraising. Their gazes met in the glass. Her lips didn't move, but her voice, thin and distant now, like it was coming down a long hallway, slid into his mind one last time. "Clock's ticking, Danny boy." He spun around. The doorway was empty. 3 months later, the for sale sign at the edge of the property sprouted like a weed after rain. The listing called it historic land with development potential, mentioned the river access and the fertile bottom fields, said nothing about curses. Within a year, a development company out of Nashville had bought most of it, talking about cabins and event spaces and heritage experiences. The remaining acres, house, family cemetery, cave rights, went to a consortium of local investors already licking their chops at the thought of expanding the ghost tours. Daniel took the check, changed his number, and moved 2 states away, to a flat place where the mountains were a rumor on the horizon and no one asked him about witches when he filled out his paperwork. On the night he signed the closing documents far back in Robertson County, a guide led a new crop of tourists down into the cave, their headlamps bobbing. At the appointed spot, he killed the lights and said in a practiced whisper, "If the Bell Witch is here, maybe she'll give us a sign." People held their breath, phones half raised, hoping for a marketable chill. Nothing happened. No pushes, no pinches, no disembodied verses of scripture. Just the drip of water and the shuffle of uneasy feet. After a moment, someone snickered. The guide cleared his throat and turned the lamps back on, talking louder to gloss over the awkwardness. They filed out, disappointed and a little annoyed, ready to demand refunds or at least a good jump scare. As they climbed back into the humid dark of the Tennessee night, an old oak on the hill above, one with roots wrapped deep around bones and stories, shivered in a wind no one else felt. In a living room hundreds of miles away, Daniel woke from a dead sleep with the taste of river water in his mouth and the echo of a woman's laugh fading from his ears. He lay there, staring at the ceiling of his anonymous apartment, heart pounding. "Clock's ticking," he heard again, but this time the words felt less like a threat and more like a dare. He got up in the morning, made coffee, went to work, answered to a shortened version of his first name on his new ID badge. When coworkers asked where he was from, he said, "Small town in Tennessee," and nothing more. He didn't tell them about the cave. He didn't correct them when they mispronounced his last name. He did not, under any circumstances, say hers. Back on the old Bell land, under tourist brochures and Instagram filters and busloads of ghost hunters, the story went on. Without him. The cave waited. The house shifted. Somewhere under the roots of the oak, something that had once been gossip and fury and a promise hummed to itself, adjusting to the new shape of its world. The curse hadn't broken. It had changed hands. And if one Halloween night someone in a far-off city at a bar said, "You know that Bell Witch story?" and the hair on Daniel's arms rose for no good reason, well, some inheritances don't show up in wills. They show up in the spaces between your heartbeats, in the names you choose to keep, and in the feeling that somewhere, in a cave, in a mountain you left behind, an old thing is still smiling, waiting to see what you'll do with a life that for the first time in 200 years doesn't start and end on haunted ground.